Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. I'm Greg.
I am Pac.
And I'm Milo.
And we are joining you with another great episode today. For people watching on YouTube, as you can see, Pac and Milo are in the same spot, currently in the United States, in beautiful New York City, the Big Apple, the city that never sleeps. How are you guys liking it there?
We are liking it in the sense that we are here on a mission, and that mission is furthering science, consuming more fiber than we have ever been able to, and also living the most boring / man-like lifestyle ever, meant in the best way possible. So we're loving it.
Specifically, we're not only advancing science. Specifically, we are not only advancing science through seeing what the human body does with 100 plus grams of fiber per day, using modified tortilla wraps with 30 grams plus fiber per wrap, but also through conducting actual science. Namely, we're conducting the first study on range of motion and lengthened partials, specifically in trained lifters. And by that, I mean we had quite a few inquiries for participation. And as far as recruitment went and who ended up in the study, we specifically went for the participants with the highest training experience. So we asked them how long they've been training for, and we specifically recruited the ones with the most training experience. So we might be looking at a sample with an average training experience of 3 to 5 years, maybe even more, depending. We'll see. So seeing whether or not lengthened partials actually produce more hypertrophy in trained lifters in the context of a pretty well-rounded upper body program with compound pressing, compound pulling, curls, tricep extensions, and so forth. So we're actually in New York for that very purpose, besides all the high fiber stuff.
Good deal. Yeah, that's hype. I'm excited to see how it goes. Also, congrats on the recent partials past failure calf raise study. Do you want to briefly recap that for the audience?
Sure.
Let people know what research you've been up to previously.
Sure. I can also recap the leg extension study if you think that would make sense.
Oh yeah, that too. God, there's been so much. There's been so much.
We have published 2 studies with the help of Stian Larsen, who is in fact Norwegian and not Danish, as I previously stated on podcasts. With his help and him spearheading data collection, we've conducted 2 studies on range of motion. The first one was a comparison of leg extensions performed with either a 40-degree hip angle, so with the rectus femoris a bit more lengthened, or with a 90-degree hip angle with the rectus femoris a bit more shortened. So essentially seeing how hip angle and therefore rectus femoris stretch impacts hypertrophy from leg extensions. And basically we found greater hypertrophy of the rectus femoris from doing leg extensions with your hips a bit more extended versus a bit more flexed, and therefore the hip rectus femoris being a bit more shortened. Similarly, we conducted another study in the calves, specifically measuring gastrocnemius hypertrophy, looking at a within participant design, comparing just doing full range of motion calf raises, wherein the set was ended when participants couldn't get another full rep on the calf raise, versus using a condition wherein after participants couldn't get a full rep anymore, they would extend the set just doing partials. So they couldn't get up all the way onto their tippy toes anymore. They would just keep going until they either just gave up, because going past failure on calf raises does involve a lot of pain, or whether they couldn't even move out of that lengthened position anymore. So either volitional failure or momentary failure in the lengthened position. And by doing lengthened partials past failure on a set per set basis, so both conditions did the same number of sets, going past failure with lengthened partials did seem to result in a bit more hypertrophy, nominally around 40% more hypertrophy. So all else being equal, if you take a set past failure on calves, you may see more hypertrophy by doing lengthened partials after failure. I call those lengthened supersets. People have called them a bunch of things. People have been doing those for a while, as Greg has outlined in a previous episode. I think you do them on basically every isolation movement. So
yeah, why not?
First study on the topic, and it does seem to help with hypertrophy.
Good deal. That's That's very hype, and congrats on both of those studies. So today, in this episode, we are going to talk about back training. What a segue. I'm a pro. But before we talk about back training, let's get some of the standard plugs up top out of the way. So if you enjoy the show, please like, rate, subscribe, and tell your friends. It really helps us out. If you're interested in hiring a coach that you work with online to help you out with your training and or nutrition, Stronger by Science has an excellent team of coaches that can help you out. You can learn more at strongerbyScience.com/coaching. If you'd like to purchase supplements from a source where you don't just have a proprietary blend, you don't know what's in it, like you want to get the actual active ingredients directly, so you're not taking a bunch of underdosed nonsense, and you want to get it at a good price, and in fact, you want to get it at an even better price, you can go to the already affordable bulksupplements.com and use code SBSPOD at checkout for an additional 5% off your order. If you want to join our communities and stay fully in the loop with goings on in the Stronger by Science universe, you can join our Facebook group, which is Stronger by Science Community on Facebook, or our subreddit, which is reddit.com/r/Stronger by Science. Check out our newsletter, where we send you high-quality, informative content every couple of weeks, not just spamming you with a bunch of ads and telling you to buy shit. And the newsletter's really been popping recently. Pack and Milo have been writing excellent newsletters, if I do say so myself. You can check that out at strongerbyScience.com/newsletter. And finally, if you have questions that you'd like us to answer on the show, record a voice clip less than 60 seconds and email it to podcast@strongerbyscience.com. So, with that all out of the way, we are discussing back training on this episode. And that is, I think, specifically upper back training. We're not talking a bunch about how to train your spinal erectors, get the Christmas tree going in the lumbar region if you get super shredded. That's not the topic of this episode. Mostly, lats, traps, rhomboids, upper back training, pulling exercises, etc., etc. So yeah, that's what we're chatting about on this episode. Just out of curiosity, why did you guys select this as a topic? Not that it's a bad topic, but do you have any specific interest in back training these days?
I mean, I think like any lifter, growing the back is pretty important, like both for physique and maybe not so much for the bench press. Like that's one of the claims I hear thrown around a lot, is that, oh, if you want to bench big weights, you need a big back, train your lats for the bench. It's super important. But I do think most people want to have more muscular backs. And I think that recently on the podcast, we've forayed into slightly more obscure or research-heavy podcast episodes. And as it turns out, back training is not one of those topics where you can super heavily lean on the research. And I think that's something that not that many people are aware of. That while we have quite a few comparisons of exercises when it comes to like the biceps, the triceps, the quads to an extent, or at least different training approaches, as we'll soon find out, there's not a whole lot when it comes to the back. And so I wanted to kind of clarify that for viewers and kind of inform people as to, hey, we don't have a whole lot, but this is how I'd go about it.
Yeah, I think something that a lot of people aren't that acutely aware of unless they read a lot of research is that when we say there's a fair bit of hypertrophy research, there is, but almost all of it is on biceps, triceps, and quads. And then there's a non-trivial amount on hamstrings, a non-trivial amount on calves, and that's about it. I'm really struggling to think of studies that assess trap growth or lat growth or spinal erector growth or, I don't know, just about anything else, delt.
Not to interrupt you,
I mean,
but we are actually
there's,
planning a study in the
there's
delts.
like 5 muscles that get all of the research. Maybe like 4 studies on pec growth or something. But yeah, like it's when it comes to back musculature, the research like directly assessing it in longitudinal studies is very, very limited.
Yeah, no, fully agreed. And I think that is one of the limitations. I think there's a discussion to be had around generalizability of findings from one muscle group to the next. Like, that is a whole different can of worms, whether or not the findings we have in the biceps or the triceps or the quads, as far as principles like, long muscle length training or loadability or what have you, whether or not the findings in those areas generalize to training all muscle groups. But I do think, as we'll discuss in this episode, there is the potential for research to be done in other muscle groups. So, for instance, one thing we're planning now with Stian Larsen, who I mentioned earlier, is at least looking into whether or not we could perform a study in the lateral delt, the side delts, on hypertrophy. Because theoretically, even using ultrasound, for example, the side delt is a relatively superficial muscle, so we could ultrasound it relatively easily. One of the obstacles in doing so is just the identification of anatomical landmarks to locate it precisely and have a valid measurement, in that we're truly measuring the lateral delt and not another area of the delt altogether. People have argued that there's many subdivisions of the delt and so forth, but I think the biceps, triceps, calves, quads just tend to be the ones that we can measure most easily as a result of ultrasounds being cheaper rather, not cheap. They're often still $10,000 to $20,000, but then using them is a lot cheaper than using an MRI. So yeah, that's why those muscles tend to be measured the most often or the most frequently. But we are planning on hopefully slowly changing that where possible.
And like you mentioned, not only are they superficial and therefore you can ultrasound them, there are also anatomical landmarks you can use to standardize the measurements. So most quad measurements and studies are taken at 50% of femur length, which, I mean, you can identify the top and bottom of the femur. Just, look at that linear distance, take half of it, make a little mark on the quad. And so if you want to make sure you're actually measuring the same point in the muscle today and 12 weeks later, that's easy enough. Whereas, for the delts, having a way to like standardize it so that you're sure you're scanning the exact same part of the muscle twice in a row, I don't think that's like an impossible hurdle to overcome, but it is a non-trivial challenge that isn't present when you're dealing with the muscles on the long bones like biceps, triceps, quads, hamstrings.
For sure, I agree. One thing Stian and I have played around with to an extent is using henna paint, so just a semi-permanent mark on the skin that can be reapplied throughout the study, so that then you're measuring the exact same site pre and post intervention, so that at least your measurement location on the body is reliable. Obviously, that doesn't guarantee perfect reliability and all that, but it is one of the sort of tricks that you can use to increase reliability of measurement and assess changes more accurately.
Sounds good.
was personally interested in back training because, as they say, shows are won from the back. And seeing as I'm an aspiring competitive bodybuilder, I wanted to make sure I get the latest info from the best source, aka Milo and Greg. So yeah. Plus, the back is not the back musculature is not something you see often. So it poses a bit of a philosophical question of whether is it really there at the moment? Like, I cannot see it. I cannot see my back at the moment. Is it there? Does it appear when you train it? This is strong by science.
That's maybe the first philosophical question that any of us contended with. Like, if you've ever played peekaboo, which I assume all of us did when we were 2 years old. I mean, the philosophical notion of object permanence, that's something that's really core to the human condition. So yeah, I like, of course the Greek person is the one that brings philosophy into it. But yeah, that is an interesting angle for the discussion of back training that would never have occurred to me. Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Philosophy by science, baby.
So let's get into it. Let's see. One of you guys want to talk about the research that does exist on back training?
Yeah, and contrary to most podcast episodes we have, I think the science segment will be remarkably short in that we have about 2 studies to discuss when it comes to back training and how it impacts hypertrophy. And worse yet, neither of these studies actually measured back hypertrophy. So we're just talking about how back training might grow your biceps instead. So first we have a study by Manarino and colleagues from 2021, truly the manliest surname there is, looking at the dumbbell row versus the dumbbell supinated curl. So specifically in 10 men, not a huge sample size, but it was a within participant design, which slightly bolsters its power. They compared doing underhand dumbbell rows with one arm to doing supinated dumbbell curls with the other. They performed 8 weeks of training, 2 sessions weekly, 4 to 6 sets in each session with their 8 to 12 rep max. So in total, they were doing around 10 weekly sets for their biceps for both arms, either with underhand dumbbell rows or with supinated dumbbell curls. They measured size of the biceps both pre and post at a couple of sites, if I recall correctly, using ultrasound. And basically, when it came to comparing the underhand dumbbell row and the dumbbell supinated curl, hypertrophy of the biceps was superior in the supinated dumbbell curl condition. So it's difficult to make any generalizations or draw too many inferences from a single study, because this is the only study we have comparing rowing exercises to curling exercises for the biceps. But I think as a very tentative takeaway from the findings on bicep hypertrophy, you could say that maybe / probably rows are not as good for your biceps as curls. And I think that's somewhat intuitive for one reason. I think when you're selecting an exercise to maximize hypertrophy of a single muscle, ideally, you probably do want that muscle to be as close to the limiting factor as possible. So when you end a set, that muscle is being taken at least relatively close to failure. I'm not sure how much that matters at the very extremes. Like if, for example, an exercise is taking the biceps to 2 reps in reserve upon hitting failure as a conceptual tool, or all the way to failure, like the biceps is what gives out. I'm not sure how much of a difference that would make, but at the very least, all else being equal, taking a muscle closer to failure via, for example, an isolation exercise should be better for hypertrophy than taking it further from failure, as would happen more typically during a compound exercise. And at least in this study, based on the findings here, something like a row might be worse for hypertrophy of the biceps than something like a curl, which makes sense. For strength outcomes, the findings were very intuitive, which is to say that strength improvements are specific. The arm that trained bicep curls saw greater gains in bicep curl 10 rep max than the arm that trained dumbbell rows. And conversely, the arm that used dumbbell rows gained more strength in the dumbbell row 10 rep max compared to the arm that did curls. So strength gains were specific, all that to say. Specifically, in this case, as I mentioned earlier, hypertrophy was measured at 3 sites, and overall, when they combined those sites, hypertrophy of the biceps was about twice as large when doing curls versus rows. Overall, the findings, as I mentioned, I think just indicate that curls are probably better for bicep hypertrophy compared to rows, and that strength improvements when it comes to curls versus rows are probably specific to the exercise you train. Nothing too groundbreaking, but I think that it is interesting, if nothing else, for people who are trying to count volume. Nowadays, one of the questions you often get for how should I be counting my weekly sets is, do you count back training as bicep training as well? The answer to that might depend somewhat on whether you're talking about rows or pull downs, as we'll come to in a second. So yeah, those are my takeaways from that study, one of only 2 studies on back training and overall hypertrophy. What do you guys think? Are those pretty reasonable takeaways?
I mean, I miss the days where things were simple, where rows were the main exercise for biceps, All you needed to do was rows, chin-ups, and focus on the compounds, which meant anything you wanted it to mean. Now we're here geeking out about bicep curls and looking at figures and charts. I mean, I'm not happy about it, but I have to accept it.
Yeah, I think the issue was they didn't do enough rows. So just while I'm being serious, I think your evaluation of the study is great. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say. This is a very non-scientific take, but like, I've done a lot of bicep curls, I've done a lot of rows, and after a set of bicep curls, it feels relatively obvious to me that my biceps worked harder. Like, I try not to be this guy, but there are studies I read that I'm like, did we need a study on this one? And in this case, it's like, yeah, like kind of no shit. Rows aren't the best bicep exercise. But while I'm being less serious, let me preface this by saying I might be about to share a little bit of fake news because I haven't looked into this that deeply. But it's just like a little like fun fact / potentially factoid, which another fun fact, different things. A lot of people use the term factoid to refer to little fun facts, but factoids are actually fake news that sound like little fun facts. So yeah, this may be a little fun fact, maybe a factoid. Who knows? And quite frankly, who cares? So the reason I give it this preface is this thing that I'm about to say. I heard from I learned from like one of my history teachers, like one of my history professors in college. I went to college as a history major, for people that don't know that bit of lore about me. And this history professor, at least 2 other times, I've repeated things that he taught us in class that have turned out to be completely untrue. So, yeah, I think he just didn't care that much, had tenure, and was just like, yeah, if I hear a fun thing in pop history books, I'll just repeat it as if it's a fact. So, all of which is to say, this may fall into the same category. But allegedly, something that folks used to wonder about was the construction of Viking longboats, because I see you guys smiling. You guys didn't expect it to go there, right?
It was a Greg ADHD masterpiece there.
This is relevant to rowing.
Let's see.
You'll see why in a second. So yeah, apparently there used to be a lot of questions and concerns about the construction of Viking longboats because, according to what people knew about boat construction, they didn't seem like they would be particularly seaworthy. Not that they would capsize or tip over, but that they were too wide and rested too low in the water, so that they would create way too much drag to actually do what it was said the Vikings did, which was, basically like roll up real quick on the shores, raid a place, and then get out before like local ships could like chase them down or whatever. And so, if they're creating that much drag, they shouldn't be fast enough to like shock people with how quickly they get to shore and start a raid and be able to escape afterwards. Too much drag shouldn't be fast enough. And they had like relatively small sails as well. So most of the power was generated by rowing, and people kind of knew how hard folks could row a boat. And they're like, none of this makes sense. Like, what's going on here? How did the Vikings do what they did? And then, like, I don't know, maybe like 20 years ago ish, they found a mass grave of Viking warriors, just where like a bunch of them had been buried. And Yes, and they could examine the bones, and so a thing about bones and muscles and whatever, all of that stuff is the size of tuberosities on of like just traction epiphyses in muscles more generally is somewhat indicative of how strong the muscles were. So your biceps, they insert on your radial tuberosity, like that's just where your biceps attach to your forearm. And the stronger your biceps are, the more linear tension they're putting on the radial tuberosity, and it's pulling and pulling. And the stronger your biceps are, the more your radial tuberosity would have to remodel. And so, kind of the bigger that bump is, generally the stronger your biceps were. And apparently, when they found this mass grave of Viking warriors, they had some of the biggest radial tuberosities the world had ever seen. And then folks were like, okay, well, never mind. That's how the Viking longboats worked. These guys were just so fucking strong that even though the boats created more drag than was optimal, they just made it work. And if anything, the wide design sitting low in the water did help them maintain stability and not capsize on the choppy North Seas. So it was like inefficient design for speed, but efficient design for stability. And they made up for the poor hydrodynamic design by just being strong as fuck. And they got that way from rowing a lot. All of which is to say, if the subjects in the Mannarino study, if instead of doing 4 to 6 sets of 8 to 12 reps for 8 weeks, if they would have instead done 8 to 10 hours of rowing every day from the time they were 8 years old or whatever, they may have gotten really impressive bicep growth from that, to the point that it would confuse modern shipbuilders.
Truly a here's your citation moment. I think we can discard that study altogether in favor of our Viking ancestors just being jacked, really. Like, if they had big biceps and all they did was row, presumably, they didn't curl, right?
That's such
one wouldn't think.
It's such a fun fact that you'd hear at certain seminars where, barbells and barbell rows specifically are presented as the thing. I could totally hear a lot of S&C coaches being like, you know what, the Vikings back in the day, blah blah blah, and and also sell like a Viking thick as a Viking back program. That could be a good product, eh? Buy it now, strongbyScience.com.
It really only works if you're doing like 6 hours of rows a day.
Good.
I mean,
also somewhat
volume.
related to that, the rowers that I have known, like the people that did competitive crew, they did all have pretty impressive bicep development. So I don't know. Yeah, I think the issue with this study is they should have just made the people do 14 times more rowing volume than curls. And you might say that's not a valid comparison. That's not science. What are you talking about? You need to equate variables between groups. But of course, 3 sets of rows isn't going to do that much for your biceps. But if you make a sport out of rowing, you'll probably get decent bicep development from it.
And that's another point in favor of extreme volumes for extreme gains. Look at the Vikings,
That's true. All right, let's move on.
Cool. So that was study number 1 on back training. And unfortunately, no back hypertrophy measurements. So we still can't tell anything about back training. And as it turns out, that is a trend that continues into the next and last study on back training for hypertrophy. This time, they compared the pronated, so overhand wide grip pull down, to the shoulder width barbell supinated curl. So, interestingly, I think that some people have written about this study, saying that the results might not generalize to like wide grip pull downs being potentially worse for bicep hypertrophy. But it's worth noting that the only study we have comparing pull downs to curls had participants do pull downs with a wide grip. And with an overhand grip, which people commonly claim is worse for biceps, like if you really want to train the biceps in the pull-down exercise, you need to adopt an underhand grip to prioritize the elbow flexors. In this case, they compared the wide grip overhand pull-down to the shoulder width barbell curl. in 29 men using a between participant design. They measured elbow flexor muscle thickness, and they trained twice a week using 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps on each set. This time, in contrast to the findings comparing the underhand dumbbell row and the supinated curl we mentioned earlier, they did actually find pretty similar, almost identical in fact, elbow flexor muscle thickness increases between doing barbell curls and doing overhand wide grip pull downs. Now, going back into the section earlier with the caveat that we can't make too large of an inference or generalization based on just one study, to me, this kind of suggests that potentially vertical pulling, like pull downs, pull ups, etc., might be slightly better for biceps than horizontal pulling, like rowing. If in an alternate universe, rowing, when you're rowing a boat, you had to row vertically, who's to say the Vikings there wouldn't have been more jacked, had bigger biceps, is what I'm saying. So yeah, if nothing else, I think we might take away from these 2 studies that pull-ups and pull-downs might be slightly better bicep builders than rows. But I think that's a tentative takeaway, and it still doesn't really tell us anything about how to grow your back, unfortunately.
I think if we want to go back to like non-scientific observations of real-world things, for pull-ups / pull-downs, I would just toss gymnasts in there. I don't think they do that many curls. They do a ton of pull-up related things. And the ones that do like rings especially, dude, their biceps are fucking huge. Like they have tremendous arm development, and that doesn't necessarily mean that rep for rep pull-ups and pull-downs are as effective as curls, but I do think it suggests that you can get pretty decent arm development by doing enough pull-ups or pull-downs.
I agree with that, and I think I've always found the claim that underhand grip pull-downs or chin-ups are better than overhand grip pull-downs or chin-ups for bicep growth, or for just elbow flexor growth, I guess, a bit odd. Greg, do you think that is true? What is your rationale for that being true or untrue?
There's one citation.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where and I think we're going to talk about this in a little bit. The idea of like what muscles or like regions of muscles the body recruits to do different things. I think a lot of that stuff is overblown. I think that if you're doing elbow flexion stuff, all of the elbow flexors are going to be worked pretty hard for the most part. And so, yeah, there's not a ton of direct evidence on it. And in terms of anecdotes, I don't really have many because like I can't do underhand grip stuff particularly well. I don't know exactly what it is. I think I just have kind of limited supination range of motion. So as I get like close to the top of a rep, it feels like it's like putting some very uncomfortable torque on my wrists. So I don't even have that much like firsthand anecdotal feeling about this stuff either. So yeah, I don't have a horse in the race, honestly.
Just a question though, because I know somebody who had a horse in the race and has answered this question with a definitive answer. When did you last compete at Mr. Universe, and what was your placing?
Never.
Okay, because Mr. Mike Menzer, RIP, who did win Mr. Universe, has stated multiple times that the lat pull down with an underhand grip is the best bicep exercise, better than curls themselves. So, I mean, Vikings, Mike Menzer, scientific evidence. That's the order, the hierarchy of scientific evidence in my head.
Straw by science strikes again. What I would say is, I think I can put forth a somewhat hot take. First, I'll discuss what I think is the common rationale for why the underhand pull down or the chin up are viewed as better bicep exercises than the overhand pull down or just regular pull up. I think, and I could be wrong here, so I don't want to strawman the usual stance, but I think it has to do with internal leverage and essentially just the quote-unquote neuromechanical matching principle. I am partial, pun intended, to the view that Greg has, which is that when a set is taken to failure, I suspect that pretty much all the muscles that can contribute at least somewhat to that joint action are going to be taken to failure. Like it's kind of like a all hands on deck sort of situation versus like a, okay, well, we're going to failure, but let's only use the muscle that has good leverage here situation. And so, like, I don't think that there's going to be a huge difference in bicep growth on account of differences in internal leverage based on length or what have you. And so I think that overhand and underhand pull downs, the bicep growth or the elbow flexor growth shouldn't differ too much on account of differences in internal leverage. So I don't think they would be that different. If anything, I could turn it around and say, well, the biceps are forearm supinators, or radial ulnar supinators rather. And if you pronate your hands, you are lengthening the biceps a bit more, which I don't think the difference in length is meaningful enough to amount to anything. But I think as a hot take, they might be better than underhand grip pull downs or pull ups for bicep growth. So yeah, it's a hot take, but I certainly don't think there's a big difference between underhand and overhand. And if anything, I would say, overhand might be better. And at least in this study, although it wasn't a comparison of underhand and overhand grip pull downs didn't seem to result in no bicep growth. So it's at least something.
Don't you think? Sorry, Greg. Don't you think reason for the underhand grip pull downs and chin ups being better for biceps may also be, at least from those that claim it, just a bit of an intuitively it makes sense because my arm is facing that way and that's how I flex my bicep. That's how I felt. Why I felt people were like, "Yep, these are better for your biceps," because there's no direct scientific evidence to like really support that.
I could see that being the case. I don't know. I do have a bit more anecdotal experience with like underhand grip versus reverse grip curls. And I can say, so I feel like, I don't know, I still feel like I get plenty of pump in my biceps doing like overhand grip pull downs. But I do wonder if people are comparing it to the sensations they get with underhand versus reverse grip curls. Because personally, when I do reverse grip curls, I feel like my brachioradialis just kind of like gets in the way a bit more and gets enough of a pump fast enough that I can't get like a really good feeling bicep contraction, which does apply for reverse grip curls, but doesn't for pronated like pulling exercises. So I don't know. I do wonder if people may be kind of like generalizing from those sensations, like, yeah, you really do feel like underhand grip bicep curls are hitting your biceps better. Therefore, underhand grip anything is hitting your biceps better. I don't know. It could be something like that.
Yeah, I do wonder to what extent, like, we commonly, and by we I mean the fitness audience, the fitness enthusiasts, commonly use how a muscle feels during an exercise as some indication as to that exercise's effectiveness. And I think, I don't know, there's a whole discussion to be had around whether or not that is even a good way to guide training. I think at this point, we are very much dealing with absence of evidence. Like, there is no strong evidentiary basis for saying that, I feel my brachioradialis more in this exercise or my biceps more in this exercise, therefore it's a better exercise for this muscle. So it's just always interesting to me how commonly people use that rationale and how widespread it is. Like, people will use it above and beyond the scientific evidence oftentimes in deciding what is a better approach, which has always been a misgiving of mine in how people approach training. So,
and the irony there with back training is that sometimes with some variations of exercises like rows and barbell rows specifically, that then stops being the case. So how a muscle feels will be used for like pull downs and whether they train your biceps effectively and which whatever machine row variation or pulled over or whatever variation is best for lats based on feeling. But then you do have proponents of cheat rows where I don't know if anybody has felt cheat rows on their back, And those are presented as game-changing, thickness building exercises for the back. So a bit of a strange one. But yeah, I am with you, my brother, in terms of, just because it feels good doesn't mean it's targeting the muscle the way you wanted.
Now, I feel like we need to dig into that because I'm confused. I feel cheat rows in my back way more than strict rows. Like, it's not even close.
But are your cheat rows or strict rows with a twist? Like, have you seen like Kyler Woolham do cheat rows with 405?
Yeah, like extremely cheaty.
And you feel them you get a back pump from cheat rows.
Yeah. I feel like my back, like, we're totally in the realm of anecdote now. Whatever.
That's the episode the people need, though.
But I feel like my lats have like a really extreme strength curve where, like, as elbow or as shoulder extension increases, like the strength drops off really, really quick. And yeah. I mean, there's similar like differences in strength curves for other exercises and whatnot, I guess. But for me personally, with my lats, and mostly for rowing, like, it does feel particularly extreme. And so I find that if I do cheat rows and really focus on like trying to resist the eccentric as much as possible, it just absolutely lights my shit up. Whereas if I'm doing like strict rows, I feel like, I don't know how to describe it, but I feel like I become unable to do reps before I am particularly fatigued or tired. It feels like my muscles just can't complete a rep anymore, but they haven't really been that stimulated. It's just like, yeah, I'm so weak in deep shoulder extension that it only takes like the tiniest modicum of fatigue before I give out. But then if I drop the loads quite a bit more so that I can do a lot of reps strict, it just feels like, I don't know, it feels the same way almost. Like I might get a little pump in my lats, but once again, it feels like I fail before I'm really like that fatigued. Comparing the sensation in my lats when I fail strict rows versus the sensation in my triceps when I fail a set of tricep extensions. But then if I get some good cheating going on and really try to resist the eccentric, the sensation I get in my lats at the end of the set then is more normalized to the sorts of sensations I would get in other muscles at the end of a set.
But you are controlling the eccentric, which is like the main thing. Like I can see how you get a nice pump if you lift a ton of weight and then you try to sort of control the weight down. But if you see people doing cheat rows, it's just absolute madness. It's just yank the bar and then throw it on the floor.
It probably would still look uncontrolled though. Like, especially with the start of the eccentric, I don't think I'm actually slowing the bar down that much, but I'm fucking trying to.
Yeah. So I guess it's almost more like accentuated eccentric training in a way.
Yeah.
As a way to do that. Which is interesting because the evidence on that is, for hypertrophy, not too compelling.
Nope.
Which just points to how little we know about back hypertrophy training. But I think that one other way, like going back to the study I outlined earlier in the episode, in the calves doing partials past failure, like, I'm not going to make sweeping generalizations about every muscle ever based on one study looking at this concept, but I think most back training is quite similar to calf training, where the shortened position, like the very top of the rep, is most challenging, like what you're describing, where you're relatively weak in full shoulder extension, and that makes strict reps feel a bit odd. That same concept of back training being hardest in the shortened position, I think may make the findings of the calf study applicable here, where doing partials after you can't do the full rep could probably increase hypertrophy, at least on a set per set basis. And in the absence of any direct evidence on back training, I think you do need to make some degree of inference and generalization from other studies. So it might be warranted to think, okay, let's find a way to make the lengthened position a bit more emphasized here, which cheat reps are technically one way to do. Like you are allowing yourself to lift more load in lengthened position by making the shortened position a bit easier to achieve, or even not caring about achieving it whatsoever. One thing you brought up, Greg, that I would want to touch on, and I know that you have a fair bit to speak on, is rows training the lats. And how do we really know that they do? Does it have anything to do with fiber orientation? Is it related to their function? Can we use fiber orientation to really inform our back training? Because we don't have any direct evidence on back hypertrophy, so we're kind of left to either making generalizations or inferences from other studies on non-back muscles, or we can also try and use biomechanics and anatomy to inform how we should train the back. I guess my question to you would be, what are your thoughts on using fiber orientation to guide back training?
Yeah, I think that's about the best you can do. But I also think it's possible to kind of like overcook it and like overgeneralize a bit. Maybe get like a little too lost in the sauce on the topic. So, for instance, there is a degree to which someone who's like maximally skeptical could say, "Hey, we don't know if pull-ups or pull-downs or rows actually grow the lats because we don't have affirmative evidence to support that." And my response to you, if someone were to say that, would be, well, technically you're correct if you don't think we have a way to make any inferences about the world without formal published science. But on the other hand, of course they do. You know, like there is a degree of skepticism that's useful and productive, and there's a degree of skepticism that is divorced from reality, I guess, where it's like, you know, there is research on this topic, but I'm sure these individuals haven't actually looked it up to see like, hey, does putting chicken in a hot pan actually cook it? You know, like, I'm sure there's research on that. I've read the research on that topic, but like, I'm sure it exists, but I'm sure these fucking people don't need research. Like, they don't personally need to see studies to support every fairly obvious thing they do in their lives, right? So, yeah, there's not any like direct research on back growth, but at the same time, hey, we know that the lats are shoulder extensors. We know that pull-ups, pull-downs, rows are resisted, like shoulder extension exercises. We know that when you do resisted exercises that train the agonist for a particular joint action, that muscle tends to grow. Therefore, yeah, like we have a pretty good idea that those are effective exercises for training the lats. And so, yeah, I mean, you can make inferences about what joint actions a muscle accomplishes based on fiber orientation. There's also a lot of like modeling research that looks at how much torque various muscles can create at particular joints for particular joint actions. There's also like acute EMG research, just looking at, hey, when you do this joint action, what muscles do we see increases in electrical activity in? There's a lot of various ways one could go about determining what the agonists for a particular joint action are. But a lot of that's fairly obvious. You know, for shoulder extension, it's mostly going to be the lats and the teres major. Scapular elevation, got some levator. You got a lot of traps. scapular retraction, mid traps, rhomboids. Most of the things that one would be curious about in terms of like broadly what muscles are being trained by these back exercises. We know that. The extent to which I say I think sometimes this gets like a little bit overcooked is I don't know like for all of this we are like everything's an extrapolation, right? Like since we don't have direct evidence on back training and like what exercises cause more growth in what muscles, like since that research doesn't exist, we are generalizing and making extrapolations from mechanistic stuff. But I do think that there's value, I guess, in being somewhat epistemically conservative about how much you do that, where it's like you want to know where like when you don't have like established facts, you kind of have to like tentatively and conservatively make inferences that are like one step removed, and then once you start trying to confidently make like inferences and extrapolations that are like 2 or 3 steps removed, I think you can start to get yourself in trouble and wind up being like way too confident about stuff where you probably shouldn't have like that much confidence about things that are like 1 or 2 degrees even more basic. Yeah, I feel like I'm rambling a bit because I don't really know how to like intro this concept all that well. But one thing that I see, so like in the absence of direct research on back training, I see a lot of instances of people trying to make like really confident inferences or predictions about like specific variations of back exercises that are going to be like way more effective at targeting a particular muscle or a particular region of a muscle based on fiber orientation or based on the principle of neuromechanical matching, and oftentimes like using those two things together. And so neuromechanical matching is, and we'll link a review paper in the show notes. But it's basically the idea that your nervous system tends to recruit the muscles that can meet the torque requirements of a particular joint action in the most bioenergetically efficient way. And so fibers most closely oriented to match the line of pull for an exercise should have a mechanical advantage. Therefore, they should be the ones that are preferentially recruited and used for that joint action. And so there is quite a bit of evidence for that concept in a general sense. There's plenty of evidence on just regional muscle activation as a real phenomenon. And for neuromechanical matching in particular, there's a reasonable bit of evidence, but a lot of the most direct evidence comes from studies on inspiratory muscles. So this was like first observed and researched in a breathing context. So like when and why might someone primarily breathe with their diaphragm versus their intercostals versus their scalenes, etc. So that's where most of the direct research on this phenomenon is. And the muscle group that has gotten the next most attention is the calves, because the bioenergetics of walking are a like well understood but also like non-trivial problem in like the biomechanics research. A lot of the biomechanical principles we know about come from like walking and gait studies, just because we do a shitload of it, and that's just what biomechanists have been studying for a long time. Like if you read biomechanics journals, like I may be exaggerating, but I feel like a third of the studies are about walking in some way, shape, or form. Like it's a very well understood phenomenon, and so If there's a new principle that you're investigating, in this case, neuromechanical matching, yeah, makes sense to look at it in a walking context. And so, yeah, like the specific calf muscles that have the most leverage to accomplish plantar flexion at various points in the stride do seem to be the ones that are most recruited. So yeah, neuromechanical matching, it's a real thing. The issue is that I think there is a tendency to overgeneralize from that phenomenon in a specific resistance training context, because most of the research does come from walking and breathing. And I don't know about you guys, but when I breathe, I'm not assessing the RPE of my diaphragm. I'm not like, oh, that was a tough one. I got 2 breaths left. You know what I mean? It's an extremely submaximal thing. Same thing with walking. Like, I'm a big guy, and sometimes I walk uphill. Sometimes I exert myself a fair bit relative to how much one could exert themselves when walking. I've also done calf raises with heavy weights to failure, and I can tell you, my calves are not being stressed nearly as much walking as doing heavy calf raises to failure. Not even close. Like, walking is a submaximal thing for your calves. And so that's relevant because there was, I think at this point there has been one study investigating neuromechanical matching in the context of like actually difficult exercise, and not even that difficult, but just like difficult-ish, where it's like, hey, instead of looking at things that are extremely submaximal, like breathing or walking, let's just ramp up the intensity a little bit and see the extent to which neuromechanical matching still applies. So there was a study in the calves where they looked at lateral gastroc, medial gastroc, and soleus recruitment as plantar flexion torque increased from 10% to 70% of MVIC. And at really, really low levels of recruitment, you saw the soleus doing the most work. You saw the medial gastroc doing the middle amount and the lateral gastroc doing the least. But then as the intensity of the contractions ramped up, and again, not even to like an MVIC, but just like 70% of MVIC, you saw the activation of all 3 muscles begin to converge. So even though the soleus was the most neuromechanically efficient one to create the necessary torque at low levels of torque requirements, as requirements increased, just the other calf muscles needed to be recruited and used more. And so, yeah, I think neuromechanical matching is like relevant in the most basic global sense to like resistance training stuff. So like, for instance, I don't like your nervous system is going to recruit the right muscles to do things. You know, like if you're trying to do elbow flexion, your nervous system's not going to be like, oh, well, let's recruit the quads just in case. You know what I mean? Like, it's like there is just the principle that, like, it is a bit of a fuzzy concept because it's hard to disambiguate it from just like, hey, I'm doing elbow flexion, my nervous system is recruiting the elbow flexors. Like, it's trying to take it one step further than that and say, hey, it's going to recruit specific elbow flexors more than others, and or specific regions of specific muscles more than others based on like fiber orientation. But it is just kind of like an extension of that like very, very basic principle that like, yeah, the nervous system is going to recruit the muscles that accomplish the joint action that's necessary. But yeah, like we see that as the level of effort increases, the muscles that need to be recruited and recruited a lot it just kind of converges on everything that it can accomplish the necessary joint actions, needing to be more active and needing to do more stuff. There's also been kind of like indirect evidence for that general idea in the context of like multi-joint exercises and what muscles are being recruited to accomplish particular joint actions. So there was a study by Kroll and Golis on the bench press back in like 2017, looking at pec and front delt and tricep activation, or well, EMG amplitudes, not exactly activation, whatever, similar enough. As loads increased from, I think, 70% to 100% of 1RM in the bench press. And what you saw was that it did seem like the nervous system favored pec recruitment. Like pec recruitment at 100% MVC wasn't that much higher than 70%. But as loads increased, muscles that maybe did have like a little bit less mechanical advantage for doing all of the things one needs to do in the bench press, so like the front delts and the triceps, recruitment of those muscles did increase as load increased, which is similar to what we saw with the calves in the specific neuromechanical matching study that I just talked about. We see a similar thing with muscles in the squat as well. Like quad EMG with 1RM loads isn't that much higher than quad EMG with like 70% 1RM loads. But as loads continue increasing, you see, or also as you get closer to failure, I forget the researcher, but there was a study on belt usage in the squat back in the day, I think from like the mid 90s, that was looking at quad and hamstring EMG as people approached failure in a squat. And yeah, I mean, it kind of seems like the quads from like rep 1 in a set with like 70% 1RM are doing about all they can do, really. And then as loads increase further, or as you get closer to failure, the body's just recruiting the hip flex or the hip extensors more and more and more to kind of like make up for it, so you can continue completing reps. I have some general thoughts about that and just kind of like quad hypertrophy studies more broadly, but that's another discussion for another day. All of which is to say, I really think the idea of neuromechanical matching becomes less and less relevant if you're actually training hard. If you are doing a single rep and like 40% of 1RM for some exercise, and you want to know, hey, what muscle or what region of a muscle is contributing most to that first submaximal rep, then yeah, go crazy with neuromechanical matching. Like make whatever inferences you want. And there's a decent chance you'll be right in making those predictions. But if you're actually training heavy, training hard, pushing sets closer to failure, your nervous system is recruiting more and more and more of the musculature that can accomplish the necessary joint actions. And I think that makes a shitload of sense intuitively, because like a basic biological principle that I don't think we think about that much in a resistance training context, because we tend to be thinking with an abundance mindset. We're training hard, we're trying to get big, we're eating plenty, we're eating a lot of protein, we're trying to get fucking jacked. That's how we tend to be oriented, but a lot of biology is oriented around how can I not starve to death? Because that is still the biggest issue for most organisms on this planet, and that was the biggest issue for humans for a long fucking time, until like the mid 50s for industrialized countries, and still for a lot of people in a lot of countries today. Like it's a really good thing that your biology is really tuned towards not starving. Like that's a big thing. And so the idea of neuromechanical matching essentially has that in mind, where it's like, you need to do something easy. You don't need to create that much plantar flexion torque, but you need to create some as you're walking along. And you're walking 15,000 steps a day. You're a hunter-gatherer. You're trying to find honey. You're trying to find edible berries. You're walking a lot. And you have these 3 different calf muscles that can all create plantar flexion torque. But one of them has slightly better leverage than the other 2. And so if the nervous system can lean on that one a little bit more than the other 2, that might save 30 calories a day, which might be critical for not starving to death. Same thing with breathing, You take a lot of breaths in a day, and if one of your inspiratory muscles has slightly better leverage than the others in particular postures, lean on that one. That's going to save some energy. Like it's an energy saving thing. Like if you can accomplish something more efficiently, you save some energy. Your biology fucking loves that shit. Like that's a lot of things are tuned to conserve energy. But guess what you're not doing when you're taking a set of bench press to failure, or rows to failure, or pull downs to failure, or pull ups to failure, or shrugs to failure? You're not fucking conserving energy. Like the challenge that your biology is facing is fundamentally different. It's not. It is much less, how can I most efficiently accomplish this relatively easy joint action? And more, the challenge is just, I need to create as much torque for this joint action at this joint as possible. And what resources do I have at my disposal to be able to do that? And if there are multiple muscles and multiple regions of muscles that can all contribute to that joint action, during the first rep, that's not maximal yet, it may not even be particularly hard, it's going to say, let's do some neuromechanical matching. Let's really focus on the muscles and the regions of muscles that are the most bioenergetically efficient to use here. But then as that challenge continues increasing, it's going to recruit more and more shit because it needs to accomplish the challenge, which is no longer conserving energy. It's just getting it done, like being able to create as much torque as you need. All of which is to say, neuromechanical matching is a real thing. And I think if you're training hard, it becomes less and less relevant beyond just the very most basic considerations of, if a muscle does have, can technically contribute to a particular joint action, but has way worse leverage, or has some other unfavorable characteristics, like for instance, thinking about the rectus femoris and the squat, the nervous system isn't going to rely on it all that much because you're also trying to extend your hips. Rectus femoris is a hip flexor. It's going to be deprioritized for that reason, so there's some other stuff like that in play. But for the most part, the harder you train, the less relevant neuromechanical matching is. I think that's. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention as well is, even to the extent that it is relevant, it's also challenging, I think, to make confident and broad generalizations about just confident and broad generalizations. I don't need to say more than that. Because for different individuals, the muscles that are prioritized, even for relatively low, low torque activities, like when neuromechanical matching is more relevant, the muscles that are recruited and prioritized early do also differ considerably between individuals. So in the calf study I mentioned, and another one that we can link in the show notes, looking at the hamstrings and the specific muscles or specific heads of muscles that are recruited in different exercises, compared to others within single individuals. There's quite a bit of variation there as well. So in the calf study I mentioned, they found that with the lowest intensity contractions, the soleus tended to be prioritized, but between individuals there was quite a bit of variation. some people were leaning on the medial gastroc a little more. I think one or two people were even leaning on the lateral gastroc a little bit more, even with the low intensity contractions. And so, yeah, like you could look at that and say, yeah, in general, based on the principle of neuromechanical matching, yeah, for low intensity stuff, body seems to use the soleus a little bit more. But you still couldn't even like confidently state that as a generalizable thing that would apply to everyone who would be receiving that information. For some people, it may be one of the heads of the gastroc. The hamstring study that will be linked in the show notes was looking at stiff leg deadlifts and Nordic curls. So like a knee flexion based hamstring exercise versus a hip extension based hamstring exercise. And yeah, they found that for those two different like types of hamstring exercises, the specific muscles being recruited, like the long head of the biceps femoris versus the semimembranosus versus semitendinosus, those three muscles have like slightly different leverages and are slightly more or less efficient for hip extension versus knee flexion based hamstring exercises. And they did see on average, you had a particular pattern of muscle activation with the stiff leg deadlift. You had a slightly different pattern of activation for the Nordic curls. But within individuals, like it was all jumbled up. Like the one that used the semitendinosus more for most people, for like 4 or 5 folks, the biceps femoris was recruited more heavily with submaximal contractions and vice versa. Like, so yeah, even to the extent that neuromechanical matching is like a true and valid and relevant principle, the specific muscles and the specific regions of muscles that are preferentially recruited and prioritized also still differ between individuals. So yeah, even to the extent that it's true, it's hard to make like that confident of generalizable statements about what's going to be prioritized for all of the people like listening to pieces of advice. So yeah, TLDR, it's a cool principle to be aware of, that matters less as you train harder.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear how many think about how many sources of inter-individual variation there could be in neuromechanical matching as well. Like even just thinking through it a little bit, if two individuals have differently sized, let's say, brachialis muscles, all else being equal, there might be differences in neuromechanical matching as well, even in submaximal tasks. Similarly, insertion sites matter, and we don't exactly know how differences in tendon attachment, etc., could impact neuromechanical matching. Like there are so many variables that could play into it, even assuming it does play a role, that it does make it very difficult to inherently draw sweeping generalizations for a given exercise for all individuals, as you mentioned. So it doesn't surprise me that there are going to be differences between individuals in what muscles get recruited at what level, essentially. The sources of variability are quite large and relatively unknowable at this point, short of just dissecting yourself and then somehow reviving yourself. Similarly, I think one thing that sprung to mind when you were talking about neuromechanical matching and how it may or may not be worth considering in your training and evidence for or against it with lifting. One thing relatively obviously is that we don't have any evidence, like any super direct evidence to date, looking at neuromechanical matching and somewhat refuting or somewhat confirming whether or not it matters for hypertrophy, like beyond the very broad level of, if a muscle can't contribute to this joint action, it's not going to be hypertrophying meaningfully. Beyond that, we don't have any direct evidence that I'm super aware of that is very directly designed to address that question, right? But one thing that comes to mind is, do you think that the evidence in favor of exercise variation for inducing more homogeneous hypertrophy in a muscle is at all evidence in favor of neuromechanical matching? Like, for example, for context for a listener, we have a meta-analysis and systematic review by Cassiano and colleagues from a couple of years ago, looking at the idea of exercise variation for inducing more homogeneous hypertrophy. So whenever you train, if you're only doing a single exercise, we do have evidence of regional hypertrophy occurring, so certain parts of a muscle growing more than others, which could imply to an extent that different areas of a given muscle, well, let's say your biceps, are more active during certain tasks than others, which could have to do with differences in activation in different muscles or different regions of a muscle during different exercises, which could be seen as neuromechanical matching. Now, because there is evidence of this happening, some could construe this as evidence in favor of neuromechanical matching for hypertrophy. So I'm curious to hear whether or not you think that constitutes any reasonable evidence in favor of neuromechanical matching being a consideration for hypertrophy.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, like, I do think that it is a, like, I think that it's like a relevant thing, but the just like how many eggs you should put in that basket is maybe not the highest. So let's see. An example that comes to mind. Man, I should have this right on the tip of my tongue. But the study that a lot of people, myself included, cite, I think most frequently to support the idea of exercise variation for making sure you get like well-rounded development in all parts of a muscle, was that one for maybe like 2012 or 2014, looking at all squats versus an exercise variation group that I think was doing a quarter of their stuff from squats, maybe some leg press, maybe some lunges and deadlifts, I believe. Similar overall quad growth, but more evenly distributed growth in all heads of the quads than just doing squats. I think that's one of those things where if you looked at those exercises, I don't think you'd have a strong a priori reason to say like, oh yeah, just doing squats, that's definitely not going to adequately prioritize the vastus intermedius. But yeah, if you add some deadlifts into the mix, like that's really going to make sure, like, due to something about the mechanics of the deadlift, is going to make sure the vastus intermedius gets targeted and utilized. You know what I mean? I think you would just look at all of those exercises and be like, yeah, you're doing some knee extension in all of them. I'm sure they train the quads just fine. And yeah, you know what I mean? So I do think that I think that it's useful and relevant in the broadest sense of, hey, we do have, like we do know and understand that different exercises can like recruit and maybe like preferentially target particular regions of a muscle. I don't think that I don't think we can have that much confidence in the exact specifics of that. And so in the broadest sense, you can say, hey, to make sure that you're like really maximally using and growing as much muscle mass as you can, do a variety of exercises, because some of them may target slightly different regions, and yeah, go for it. You know what I mean? There's a difference between that and very confidently saying no. Like you really need to fucking add lunges into your quad training routine because you're gonna get 3% less vastus intermedius growth if you just do squats. You know what I mean? Like there is a difference between those two things. And I don't want to overstate my skepticism, I guess. It's as the challenge in an exercise ramps up, the amount of musculature recruited does as well, which does make neuromechanical matching less and less relevant as the challenge in an exercise increases. But there is still a difference between muscles that are like really like maximally or near maximally recruited and utilized from the start of a set, like pecs in the bench press or like quads in the squat, and muscles that you see like a ramp up in recruitment as a set goes on. So like with the squat studies I mentioned, you did see an increase in hamstring EMG as either loads increased or as sets got closer to failure. But you also don't tend to observe that much hamstring hypertrophy from squat training. So, more and more hamstring did need to be used, but it also doesn't seem like the hamstrings wind up being used enough to get like a super robust training stimulus. And that may be relevant in certain exercises for some things, you know what I mean? So it could be that for, I don't know, like for the lats, for instance, since we're talking about back training here, like your lat fibers with like closer to a horizontal orientation would have like a more direct line of pull, and better like leverage for rowing type exercises. And the ones that originate closer to the ilium and are more vertical, theoretically, they would be like more effective for like row or like pull-ups or pull-down type exercises. And so like there's no direct evidence on this, but like I find it very plausible that if you were doing a set of pull-ups, those kind of more vertically oriented fibers would be recruited the most and, might experience the most stimulus, the most growth from pull-ups or pull-downs. And then as the set gets closer and closer to failure, kind of the fibers in your lats being worked, it just kind of gradually creeps up the muscle until near failure. You do still produce shoulder extension from the more horizontally oriented ones that like originate on the thoracic vertebra. But it could be that recruitment of those ramps up late enough in a set that they're still contributing quite a bit for the last rep or two, but they're not getting like the strongest stimulus. You know what I mean? And so, but it wouldn't be the case that like only the most vertically oriented fibers are getting a robust stimulus. Like it's less of a binary thing and more of just like the stimulus spreading as things get harder. But muscles that are kind of like the most distant from what was optimal at the start of a set may still end up getting recruited, but like not stimulated that hard by the end of a set. But there will wind up being more musculature that is stimulated well than one would like predict based on what's most efficient at the start of a set.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that as little as we know about neuromechanical matching and what the direct implications for hypertrophy then are as a result, I think that just keeping in mind what the joint functions are for different muscles and making sure that you're covering a variety of them within your program is a decent coverall from a practical perspective. Because even if there are differences in neuromechanical matching, say if you're only doing the underhand lat pull down, if you're then throwing in some overhand lat pull downs, maybe some pullovers, maybe some other rowing exercises as well, the minor differences in how differences in activation might cause differences in hypertrophy in your lats, for example, in just the underhand pull down, will then in all likelihood be washed away if you add in 1 or 2 or 3 more back exercises total. And I think especially for a set of relatively diverse muscle groups as are present in the back musculature, just adding in total like 2 or 3 exercises for the back at least across your training week, I think will largely circumvent any just theoretical concerns at this point about how neuromechanical matching could impact back growth. I think that at this point, it's much more of a semi-founded theoretical concern than it is anything that we need to be overly concerned about when it comes to back exercise selection. Or at least that's my view. I think the reason why it's been spoken about so much online is in large part just we don't have any direct evidence. So I think it has led to a lot of theory crafting around, if we consider fiber orientation, this exercise might be best. But I think that's probably misguided to an extent, given that there are other principles of exercise selection we do have that have a fair bit more direct evidence behind them. versus neuromechanical matching directly impacting hypertrophy a ton, especially as I said, it's taking closer to failure, as we've mentioned quite a few times. So yeah, I think it's something that can be put in the basket of may or may not be important, but not something we need to consider overly heavily at this stage in the research sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that in the absence of strong, robust, direct evidence, there is just kind of like there's a tendency of people to want to like argue about shit. And when you're dealing with a topic where there's really no good reason for anyone to be like super confident about anything, it it kind of gives people a bit more license to just to kind of like cook a little bit harder, where it's just like no one has a trump card. No one has we have this study on this specific thing that found this, and it's good because it was in this population, good design, strong controls, blah, 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 whatever. Like when you don't have that, and you really want to stake a position on these are the best back exercises. Yeah, like you kind of, you got to do, you got to do a bit more work to try to justify a level of confidence in things that no one really has that good of a reason to be that confident about in the first place. And I think that I don't know. I think that it then ends up leading to people diving into PubMed, trying to find stuff that seems like it could be like useful and relevant for being able to like stake strong positions on topics like this. And personally, here was so I don't know if you guys know this, but like I'm basically not on social media anymore. I like I'll check the Stronger by Science groups and the macro factor groups. And that's about it. Like if I scroll a feed, the first time I see something that annoys me, I'm just like, that's enough for the day, and I sign off. So I don't follow the chatter that closely at all anymore. And the thing that broke me, honestly, and like maybe I shouldn't admit this, but like who cares? If people get mad about this, I'm not going to see it anyways because I'm not on that shit. But there was like a multi-month fight about whether the lats wrap around the rib cage. And people going back and forth about that as it related to like exercise selection, like, oh, do they wrap around the rib cage? Does that mean that like some particular like row variation is going to stimulate the lats more and all of that? And like when I first saw it, I was like, oh, this is interesting. Let's look at a post or two, check people's sources, because like, yeah, maybe there will be some interesting points raised, and if nothing else, I can get some fun citations out of it to like learn a little bit more about back anatomy or whatever. And then as I kept seeing shit about it the next day and the next day and a couple weeks later, and then it gets brought up like a month later, I was like, no, just no, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, it became obvious that there was no, that there was no like conclusive proof that could like carry the day and convince all parties, and B, even to the extent that one could establish that the lats did or did not wrap around the rib cage, you're still then like 2 steps removed from being able to say that like some particular exercise definitely causes more lat growth or not, because there's no fucking direct evidence on that in the first place. And just like the more and more that shit kept popping up on my timeline, the more and more I just thought I should log off. Like I need to, this is rotting my brain. And so, yeah, it was a combination of factors, but that was one of the most salient. And so now, yeah, I'm just like not on social media anymore. And so, yeah, if people are still talking about this shit, I don't know, and also I don't care.
Yeah, I fully understand. And I think when it comes to exercise selection and a large amount of decisions being made in the gym, like in a practical context, it's become very popular as of late. I'm telling you this because it sounds like you're not on social media anymore. It has become very popular as of late
Fill me in.
amongst certain crowds to like critique the idea that you can use science to inform what you do in the gym.
Sick.
And
Hell yeah.
while that is true to an extent, like you're not going to do exactly the program being used in some of these studies, or you probably shouldn't. That doesn't mean that you can't glean insights into generalizable principles that will then inform your training, and that you can then combine different principles, and that can very easily form the basis of your program. But there has been the argument made that what happens in the science doesn't actually inform your training. You couldn't write a program that is actually based on science at all, and that's a bit black and white. I think that's very uncharitable. But I do think that a lot of exercise selection and a lot of decision making in the gym is kind of tantamount to gambling or like educated betting sort of thing, where you do have generalizable principles that seem to hold true most of the time in most circumstances across the studies we have at least. So then you use those principles and you make an educated guess, and you think this is more likely to work than not, and you do that. And I think with backtraining specifically, that is kind of what you have to do. And when you get to the stage where on social media you're arguing about whether or not an assumption holds true, that is still about 2 to 10 assumptions away from having any relevancy to actual hypertrophy outcomes, yeah, that is when your gambling may have gone one step too far, and you are just essentially engaging in sophistry at that point. And that's fun, but not really relevant to training necessarily.
Yeah, dude, I think the world would be so much better if, and I totally understand that I'm sounding like my parents at this point. Like, why don't they teach kids the important and relevant stuff in school? But instead of saying, they need to teach people how to do their taxes, I'm going to argue that people should learn something that's even less useful and relevant to their day-to-day lives, but will help inform their thinking and decision making throughout their lives. I think people in school should take a course on philosophy of science and inference, because, yeah, like, I don't know. There's, God,
Can I throw out a hot take real quick?
Just the idea that like you would completely eschew things we can glean from the scientific process because you wouldn't apply training protocols used in research studies 1-to-1 in the real world is that's a hell of a take. I mean, like there is a bit of like reasoning that needs to be done. Like is something so unrepresentative of how people train in the real world that maybe it does limit the generalizability. Like that is, you do see protocols like that from time to time. It's like, okay, well that's something to consider. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like I mentioned like food science before. It's like if you've seen like a food science lab, it doesn't look fucking identical to your kitchen. But if someone figures out like, hey, this is something that like increases Maillard browning, like it doesn't matter that they're using like research equipment and like every fucking sensor in the world in order to do it, and it doesn't look like the gas range in your house, like shit still works. Like it generalizes, you know what I mean? And yeah, some things generalize, some things don't. And yeah, like that's wild. Like so many things you use in day-to-day life come from like research that was done in like a contrived sense. Like the fucking everyone uses GPS, and like the basic research that was originally conducted in order to like establish that was like a thing, I don't know, looks different from like satellites up in the sky that are beaming position data down to your phone. But it's like, yeah, you're going to use GPS. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree fully. It's something I've struggled with both in the applied setting and in the research, where I think in the applied setting, at a certain level, it's almost fashionable for coaches to resort to it depends-isms, where they cannot ever give an answer that is true on average or likely to be true on average. They always just have to resort to independism and contextualism, where I don't know if it's just become a norm or whether it's indicative of a lack of expertise or what have you, but I have seen many, many coaches always just resort to a default answer of it depends. And much in the same way as it pains me to see people view generalizability of inferences in a black and white fashion, and often be overly cautious in the research setting of having any confidence in generalizing stuff. It pains me to see coaches just resort to, oh, I see that some experienced coaches say it depends as an answer to most questions they get asked. That must mean that is what expertise is. When in reality, you can still have confidence in there being average effects. You can also express that with caution, but saying it depends isn't really informative. Just the same way as saying that research never applies or generalizes or has ramifications for your training is also not informative, and it's also unreasonable. So, I don't know, I think sometimes as an evidence-based fitness crowd, we get lost in some of this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think with the it depends thing, I do think that there's a little bit of monkey see, monkey do. And a lot of people that I have seen just go with like a blanket it depends to everything. I do often think that is a nice little dodge for I don't know. Because if you like, I am notorious for slipping a bunch of it depenses into a lot of the things that I say. And if I do just give like a flat it depends, sometimes it's because I don't know and I don't want people to know I don't know. But rarely. Most of the time when I say it depends, it's because I'm being a dismissive little prick. Because someone asked me a question and I the actual like it depends answer would be like, here's like the average effect, but there's like several things that could modulate it, and like here's why, and here's just like a branching tree. And I think about it for a second, I'm like, oh god damn, I don't have 30 minutes to type an answer to this question, so yeah, it depends. Try it out, see what happens. And I do think a lot of people that have expertise, a lot of answers start with it depends, and then it's a long answer. It's like, it depends on these 5 different things, and here's a branching path of logic that depending on which of these things apply to you, we do still wind up with some sort of like tangible, actionable advice at the end. But then I think a lot of people who want to fake expertise see that the answer starts with it depends, and they're like, "Ooh, baby, yeah, let's use this." Yeah, I don't know, but I apologize to anyone listening if you've asked me a question and I responded with something that was just like, it depends, whatever, just try something out. I probably had a lot of questions in my inbox, and I was just being a dismissive little prick, and I apologize for that.
Yeah, that's totally understandable. I think that what I've seen happen, maybe kind of bringing those 2 points together, is that people say it depends, and then bring up a list of variables that they have no evidence for the answer depending on. So like they'll say, oh, it depends on your overall program, this and this and this. And oftentimes when you actually dig into it, I don't know that it depends on that. I don't know that we have evidence for it depending on those things, at the very least. Is it possible? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But are you potentially just listing other variables in an attempt at making it seem complex and making yourself seem expertly? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Another thing I'll say, though, to kind of shift responsibility a little bit, I do think a lot of times when I give a flat it depends answer, what I actually mean is you didn't provide me with nearly enough information or context, and I don't feel like having an extended back and forth with you in order to extract the information and context I need to give you a confident answer. So yeah, like I could either type for 30 minutes to explain everything it depends on, and you can figure out which one of these roads applies to you, or I could ask you a series of questions. And since I check social media once a day, I can wind up getting an answer to you 10 days from now, which neither of us want to do. Or I can just be a little dismissive and say, it depends. Um, I do think I do think a lot of that could be circumvented by people putting a little bit more effort and context into questions they ask in the first place. That makes it way easier to narrow shit down. Instead of like brother, if someone asks me like, hey, should I do bench press or dumbbell press? And that is the extent of the question. You're getting either an it depends or do whichever you like more. Like that's going to be my answer to that question, because if you don't even tell me what your fucking goal is, or a little bit about your experience with the two exercises, or goddamn anything else, if you just say which one of these do I do, you're getting a dismissive response, because like, you're being lazy enough. You're being lazy. I'm being lazy. Like you put a little work into making sure I have enough information to answer the question. I'll give you a good answer. You know what I mean? I think that there's an element of that as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think the degree to which your answer is informed and helpful depends on how informed and helpful the question is. So like if someone asked me that question, I would just be like, I think on average this one is better. Do that, I guess. You know, that's the best you can do at that point. Shifting gears a little bit and going back into what the episode is actually about, as opposed to finessing the listener into a philosophy of science episode. Really did them dirty here. Why don't we have more direct evidence in the back musculature? Like, obviously we have studies in the biceps, triceps, quads, and calves, and that's for a relatively simple reason. It's just that those muscles are, one, the quads tend to apply to a lot of athletic tasks. So like the squat, for example, is one of the most commonly researched exercises. And if a study seeks to glean insights into morphological adaptations or hypertrophy outcomes or what have you, the quads tend to be measured quite consistently. In addition, the quads, calves, biceps, triceps, even the pec to a slight extent, are relatively easy to ultrasound, and with ultrasound being one of the most commonly available and cheapest ways of assessing changes in muscle size, that is what is typically done. The issue with ultrasounding the back is that it's quite tricky. So the back has a lot of different muscles, which, as Greg outlined earlier, they have a lot of different functions. Some of them are more superficial, some of them are deeper, since ultrasound is predicated on the depth of the muscle as well. If a muscle is a bit deeper, it can be difficult to get a clear image and therefore outline its aponeurosis, the interfaces and what have you, and clearly measure the thickness of the muscle that we're trying to measure. So ultrasounding the back musculature, to my knowledge, I haven't seen any studies do it, like in humans at least. But Greg, as I understand it, you have seen some studies that have used MRI to assess the back muscles. So I want to get your opinion on, could we use MRI to assess increases in muscle hypertrophy of the back musculature?
Yeah. So there will be a couple studies about this linked in the show notes. This wasn't something that I had looked into prior to you tagging me in the outline saying, have you seen studies using MRI on this? And I had it when you asked, but I was pretty sure that there had been studies that had assessed back muscle size in vivo. And so I was like, yeah, I can dive into the old PubMed machine and see what's going on here. And yeah, so you can use MRI. Several studies have. There's even been research evaluating the reliability of measurements of various back muscles using MRI, and the reliability is pretty good. Low percent CV values. It seems like you can measure back muscle pretty well. I do think it would probably depend on the region of the muscle you're talking about. So With the lats, for instance, I think you could probably reliably measure them a bit higher up, but I think the further down you go, once you start getting into muscles that originate or insert in the thoracolumbar fascia, I think things would start to get pretty sketchy pretty quick, because there's a lot of shit going on in there. Like very thin sheets of muscle interspersed with relatively thin sheets of fascia. Like it becomes a mess. But I do think that for like a lot of the meat of the lats, you could assess it pretty well. Traps, I see absolutely no reason that would be an issue. Rhomboids, they're deep. Might be challenging with ultrasound. MRI should be fine. It can be assessed. I think at least in the outline, one of the questions here was, why is there not more research on back musculature? I'll just tee myself up for that one. So why is there not? Since you can seemingly measure it with MRI relatively well. I think that there are a few things in play. One is, like you mentioned, Milo, ultrasound is a lot more accessible, and it is more challenging to use ultrasound for superficial muscles, like for the traps, for the lats. I think you should be able to use it just fine. Like for lats, like we've mentioned already, there is research assessing pec hypertrophy. And I think you would probably standardize lat ultrasound measurements the exact same way you would standardize pec. Like just, count the ribs and just make sure you take the measurement at the same rib each time. I really can't think of a reason that wouldn't work just fine. But yeah, some other back musculature, it's deep, difficult to standardize. But I think that there are a few other factors in play. So one is just simply, why study something hard when you can study something easy? It is easy to take an ultrasound scan of the biceps or quads. You don't need to deal with logistical hurdles related to scheduling time with an MRI. It's just easier to do. And there's more stuff to draw upon. Like I said, I really can't think of a reason that you couldn't just ultrasound the lats the exact same way you do the pecs, count the ribs, do it at the same rib each time. But since people don't do that, before you could do a hypertrophy study, you would first need to do a reliability study, because it has previously been established that you can reliably assess pec size with ultrasound. So you can just say, hey, we're doing this thing. Other researchers have done it. Here's a citation. It's reliable. Bada bing, bada boom. Good to go. Before you introduce a new measurement, you should validate that you can make valid and reliable measurements. So you'd probably still need to schedule time with an MRI and say, hey, we used this as the criterion measure. We took a bunch of ultrasounds. We did a reliability study. Basically you would need to do a study before you could do the study you wanted to do, just to make sure your measurement was good. And so, why do something why do that when you could just do another study on the quads? You know what I mean? That's the first thing. Why do something hard when there's plenty of things that are still fucking hard, but quite a bit easier that you could do instead? The second is, why do something expensive when you can do something cheap? Your lab probably has an ultrasound already. You probably don't have an MRI in your lab. You would need to pay, in all likelihood, to schedule time with an MRI. A lot of schools, there's no MRI on campus. You would need to pay to access an MRI at a local hospital. And even for schools that do have MRIs on campus, like if it's if it has a medical research wing of the school, oftentimes even between departments, you still have to pay the other people at the school for time with the MRI. So there generally is not that much funding in hypertrophy research. Money's already pretty tight. So why do something expensive when you can do something cheaper? That is a factor. Another factor, even even if money wasn't a concern, why take slow measurements when you can take fast measurements? Pre and post assessments, especially if you're doing a lot of stuff, taking a lot of measurements, can be annoying to schedule. They tend to be the longest visits that you're going to have with research subjects. They can present a burden if someone has like a tough schedule, lives far from the lab, or would need to come in on weekends for like longer visits. And so if you would need to use an MRI, even if you had funding for it, just takes longer to get an MRI than it does to do an ultrasound scan. So why do something slower when you can do something faster instead? And like I mentioned, a lot of this has to do with funding. So, yeah, both in terms of like if you needed access to an MRI, and also just like is anyone going to pay for research on the back in particular? So a lot of like hypertrophy research in healthy young adults, like a lot of that you're just kind of like scraping together any funding you can get. But you know, there are a lot of things that do get funded because they relate to like disease states in particular populations. Like you're not trying to get like a $2,000 grant from a supplement company to do the bicep study you want to do. You're getting a tens or hundreds of $1,000 grant from the NIH to do something that's related to oftentimes like osteoporosis or osteopenia research, sometimes like gait or balance conditions or like stroke rehab or whatever. Like there's a lot of things where there is big money sloshing around. And I'll tell you what, it's not fucking trap growth or lat growth. Like I can't, as cool as I think it is, most people with the money to write big checks, aka governments, and sometimes medical organizations, they're mostly interested in like resistance training interventions. If they're funding resistance training stuff, they're mostly interested in things that have like a big effect on activities of daily living. And the biggest thing for activities of daily living is just like, are you ambulatory or not? Like, can you get around on your own? Can you walk upstairs? Can you stand up from the toilet? Can you safely bathe yourself? A lot of that stuff is lower body. You know, you're interested in the hip musculature, you're interested in the calves, you're really interested in the quads because there's like a lot of quad atrophy with aging. Sometimes interested in grip for that reason because you know, we have opposable thumbs, primates, very cool. Got to be able to hold on to stuff. I really can't think of that many instances where like weak lats inhibit your ability to carry out activities of daily living. So yeah, I mean, there's less big money sloshing around to study back hypertrophy or back strength. And lastly, there's just like difficulties and potential confounders downstream of a lack of basic science. So for instance, there's a lot of research looking at hypertrophy of the quads and biceps. And there is also research looking at the ability of people to voluntarily activate their quads and biceps. And we know that in relatively healthy people, they don't struggle to activate, recruit, utilize that musculature. Outside of certain disease states, you can tap into basically all of your motor units to create torque. So if you're interested in whether two different exercises or two different variations on an exercise cause like different amounts of quad growth, you can safely say that, hey, it's due to like these different characteristics between the exercises, whatever. You don't necessarily have to say, well, this could be due to something related to the intervention, or it could just be that people can't activate their quads. You know what I mean? Like that's not a method of inquiry you need to, or like a line of inquiry you need to really contend with. Whereas a lot of like basic science research like that hasn't been done for back musculature. So in the absence of that, any study you did do, you would have to inherently make more tentative inferences. You could say, hey, due to some characteristic of the exercises used, this lat exercise was better than that one or whatever. But it very well could be that instead of like percent VA for the lats being like 95% plus like it is for the quads, it very well could be that it's 70%. And it very well could be that just due to small sample sizes and quirks of randomization, you just had one group of people that just really couldn't recruit their lats all that well. And the exercise they did was perfectly effective, but it looks like it wasn't because voluntary activation is poor. Like, I don't think that is a thing. I think people can activate and utilize their lats just fine. But I couldn't point to a study to verify that. So, until that research is done, literally any research you did, you would have to be you'd have to be way less confident in the sorts of inferences you could draw. And I think that also just presents some friction. Like people want confidence in the results of their studies, and you can quite frankly just have more confidence in studies on the quads or the biceps than you could in studies on the traps or lats or whatever, because we know more about like the neuromuscular function of the biceps and triceps and quads than we do about the lats. So, I think that's like a relatively low on the list of reasons why people aren't doing this research, but I wouldn't be surprised if that contributes as well. But I think a lot of it is just like time and money, and just kind of like, why bother, like you guys can attest to this. Doing a training study is a hell of a lot of work. And we already know a lot about these other muscles. And like, if you're going to take like the time and effort to do a training study, you want it to be on something that like you feel pretty good about. Like this shit's going to work and like be publishable. Like you don't want to sail into the unknown, and just like wind up with something that's like not publishable due to question mark. Yeah, like maybe you can't take good measurements. Maybe as you're doing your study, the first study looking at voluntary activation of the lats comes out, and guess what? It's 60% in healthy young people. So, oh fuck, you didn't get that data on your subjects, and so now that like questions whatever inferences you can make from the study you just did. Like, yeah, like why fucking do that when you know you can do. When you can investigate similar questions on muscles we know more about. So yeah, I think those are some of the biggest things contributing.
Yeah, and those were all the issues we had to consider now before running the partials versus full ROM study. Because ideally, it would have been cool to look at the back, but one, ultrasound may have not been that reliable, especially with participants having to be marked at specifically the same place, and so on and so forth. Plus MRI, assuming we had like hundreds of thousands in funding to be able to pay an external, hospital or whatever for us to do the MRI. As you mentioned, we would then have to figure out how in New York City we would have to get each participant to get the MRI, and so on and so forth. So biceps and triceps it is.
Oh yeah, I mean, another thing as well, like you saying that just made me remember this. If you don't even if money's not an issue, if there's not like an MRI at your school that like different people can just schedule time with, there aren't that many fucking MRI machines out there. And in most medical systems, there's like a multi-month wait time to schedule an MRI for like a serious medical condition that needs an MRI. So there's also a question of just like, is this efficient and quite frankly, like ethically justifiable use of like critical medical infrastructure?
Yes.
How many people are going to die because because like it takes too long to diagnose something that they needed an MRI for because I scheduled 40 people to get lat MRIs for a hypertrophy study.
But don't do it,
there very well may
be
be kind of like second order unintended effect related like body counts of your study. So you don't want that blood on your hands.
Yeah, no. I think that all of those are valid obstacles to studying the lats, and the incentives also seem to be stacked in favor of measuring other muscles. Like you mentioned, in athletic performance, oftentimes we care more about the quads or the hamstrings than we do about the back musculature necessarily. And so, both as far as obstacles in the way of measuring the lats, like even with ultrasound, I know you mentioned identifying the landmarks anatomically to get reliable sites of measurement. That is relatively straightforward, the way you described it. The one caveat I would give to that, just from experience, is I do think most people store a fair bit more subcutaneous adipose tissue in like where you'd measure the lats versus where you'd measure, for example, even the pecs. And if they have several centimeters of subcutaneous adipose tissue where they have their lats, that can make visibility a whole lot less effective, clear. And then measuring the lats becomes a lot more challenging. Like certainly with subcutaneous adipose tissue being larger in some participants than others, even for the calves, it can be relatively difficult to measure the gastroc. Even for the triceps, and those are probably smaller muscles in thickness than the lats, and probably carry less fat compared to like where you carry fat on the lats. So visibility can be a real concern there as well. So all of those reasons why we don't have studies in the lats. Let's talk about some practical stuff. I think that as far as actually training the back musculature goes, there's kind of some quick and dirty guidelines I use for classifying like different functions of different parts of the back. You can certainly get more granular than this, but I'm not sure it would meaningfully improve your programming or your subsequent results. So for my purposes, I typically categorize the functions of the back into kind of like 3 muscle groups or 3 types of functions I need to worry about. So I kind of classify the lats and the teres major together, as they tend to share many functions, the sort of upper back, mid back together, so the lower trap, the mid trap, the rhomboids, and so forth, and then the erector spinae, which are kind of separate. I'm not sure we even necessarily want to talk about them at length, pun intended. And then finally, the upper traps and the levator scapulae. I think those are kind of like the 4 muscle groups I would consider, and they each have slightly differing functions. So for the lats and teres major, I typically think of their functions as being shoulder extension, like any sort of pullover motion, and shoulder adduction. So if you think about a full range of motion lateral raise, you think about the eccentric phase of that movement, that would be shoulder adduction. So essentially, to train them, I typically think those 2 functions, to train the lats and teres major. So that could be a cable pullover, a dumbbell pullover. Most pull downs will train those relatively well through shoulder extension or shoulder adduction. We'll go into exercise selection more specifically later, but just kind of being aware of those functions when considering exercise selection is a good thing. Just so that then you can pick at least one exercise targeting one of those functions in your program, just so you have a reasonably well-rounded program in targeting most of the muscles in all likelihood. Then when it comes to the lower traps, mid traps, and rhomboids, their main functions seem to be scapular adduction, so essentially like bringing your shoulder blades closer together, and scapular depression, so kind of bringing them down. And so oftentimes, those functions would be accomplished during most rowing exercises. Then we have the erector spinae muscle, which is what a lot of people refer to as lower back muscle. I'm not sure many people necessarily think of the quadratus lumborum, I think that's the name. I don't know how you pronounce it, because I've never heard anyone say it, because that's how rarely it's spoken of outside of therapeutic contexts.
Yeah, you got it. As someone with a janky QL, it is quadratus lumborum, and you nailed it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But most people think of the lower back musculature as the erector spinae, which, contrary to popular belief, there are 3 different submuscles in that muscle group. And some of them run quite far up the spine, and so they can actually make, I think, an appreciable difference to the appearance of your back. So having a more developed erector spinae muscle can make your back look a bit bigger overall, even sort of like your mid and upper back, depending on the section you're hypertrophying meaningfully. But the main functions of that muscle are going to be lateral flexion of the spine, like dumbbell side bends. The individual Greg was previously referring to, who was doing a lot of side bends in the gym and had the most developed obliques in the world, may also have had very developed erector spinae muscles, because that is one of the functions of the erector spinae. And then secondly, they're also responsible for spinal extension. So whenever you're thinking of keeping your back straighter, for example, during a deadlift or a squat, it is your erector spinae being involved heavily in keeping your back more extended. Which makes it all the more interesting when people refer to squats and deadlifts meaningfully targeting like building your six pack, because your rectus abdominis muscle is responsible for the opposite of that function. So if anything, activating that muscle would make the job of the erector spinae more challenging. So just a fun aside. But meaningfully, like practically, I think that hip hinging, so RDLs, deadlifts, and even squatting movements where you have a meaningful amount of load on your back and you're trying to keep your spine extended, they will provide a decent amount of stimulus for your erector spinae. You can include some isolation work, or you can try and purposely extend and flex your spine during rows, for example, but those would be the kind of ways you would want to train your erector spinae. And then finally, we have the upper traps and levator scapulae, which are broadly responsible for scapular elevation, so shrugs, essentially. So I think those are the kind of 4 muscle groups I would consider when considering your back training, and just having at least one exercise that reasonably targets those. Each one, if you want to have relatively well-rounded programming and hypertrophy of the back musculature. In general, as I mentioned earlier, with the regional hypertrophy systematic review by Cassiano and colleagues, I do think having at least 2 to 3 back exercises in your program every week is reasonable, and trying to hit those main categories of like one movement that's predominantly targeting shoulder extension and adduction to target the lats and teres major. One movement that's primarily targeting scapular adduction and depression, like some sort of row variation for your lower trap, mid traps, rhomboids. Some sort of shrug variation being beneficial for your upper traps and levator scapulae. Those are probably good ideas. Obviously, not everyone cares about their upper traps. Not everyone cares about maximally hypertrophying their erector spinae, but just being aware of the functions that they are responsible for can allow you to train them should you desire to actually train them. So yeah, I think those are kind of like the broad takeaways I would give on exercise selection. There are additional considerations for what makes an exercise good for the back. I think that, broadly speaking, they're the same that make any exercise decent for hypertrophy. We don't have a ton of granularity here. Like we mentioned, we don't have direct comparisons of different back exercises, so we have to rely on generalized principles from other muscle groups to inform this. I think that as Mr. Lengthen Partial himself, you can make a decent case that the back training, and the back specifically, could benefit from lengthened partials or emphasizing the lengthened position somehow, just because the most back exercises you can think of, whether you're talking about row variations, pull downs, or pull-ups, tend to be most challenging in the shortened position. And so relatively speaking, you are missing out on some challenge and loading in that lengthened position. If you were to do some partials after you hit failure and do those in the lengthened position, that would be one way of doing it. Or you could just use lengthened partials, or like Greg was doing with cheating the weight up a little bit, that is another way to emphasize the lengthened position, because you're making the shortened position easier and getting more load in the lengthened position ultimately. So yeah, I would say those are the main things to consider exercise selection-wise. Obviously, the same things, like the same basics, like, make sure the exercise is sufficiently loadable, that you can actually get close to failure. But I would hope that the listeners of the Trauma by Science podcast would be aware of those things that you pretty much learn on day one in the gym already.
Yeah, I agree with all of that.
Wow. That was I love how the philosophy of science section of the podcast was not contentious, but certainly a lot to be said about it. Meanwhile, as far as actually training in the gym, it's like, yeah, just do some of everything and, you're good.
Yeah, I think the basic takeaway is all of the things you think you already know about back training, guess what? It's right. Yeah, the exercises that target your lats, that you think target your lats, guess what? They do. Yeah.
That's a hot take right there. From a more practical perspective, and just as a coach, there are a few guidelines I like to follow when it comes to programming. One is, like any muscle, if you're trying to maximize hypertrophy, it probably makes sense to do most of your training in a relatively heavy rep range, just to make sure you're training pretty close to failure. There is some research by our own lab suggesting that when you go much past around 12, 15 reps, your accuracy in gauging how many reps you are away from failure might tend to decrease. So you're most accurate in gauging how close to failure you are when going relatively heavy, like maybe below 12 reps or so. So practically, I'd say do most of your training between 5 or 12 reps. But then, including a variety of rep ranges across the week, probably a good thing. Maybe going all the way up to 20 reps or 30 reps on occasion, maybe even higher if you wanted to. Then another practical consideration is, as I mentioned, I think 2 to 4 exercises or so as a sort of like rough ballpark, maybe even a minimum for back training, depending on whether or not you include the erector spinae and upper trap exercises as well, is a reasonable guideline. What I would do, just to sort of like cover any additional bases, just in case it makes a meaningful difference, would be to try and have a variety of both direction of pulling, so some vertical pulling like pull-ups or pull-downs, and some horizontal pulling like any sort of rowing variation across the week. And additionally, if you want to go the extra mile, I tend to think of it as also like maybe day 1 has some overhand pulling, day 2 has some underhand pulling, and day 3 has some neutral grip pulling. Just varying the grips being used might provide some additional variation, and with how many different muscles are present in the back and how their functions vary, that might meaningfully increase variation and increase hypertrophy and sort of maximize homogeneity of hypertrophy, because regional hypertrophy is a documented phenomenon from training. But equally, in my experience, most people do have a slight preference for one grip over another. Like, for example, for me personally, as a lifter, most of my lifting career, neutral grip rowing and pull downs have just felt the best. Like, they don't seem to bother my elbows or my joints all that much. I feel my lats the most. And so if there is one grip that you prefer over another, I think it's fine to bias it most of the time. I see it as similar to rep ranges, where if you really enjoy somewhat higher rep training, you can probably do most of your training in that rep range. And as long as you have some variety in there, I can't really make the argument that you're necessarily missing out on growth. And the same thing goes, I think, for neutral grip versus overhand grip versus underhand grip. So yeah, and the final thing I'll say is, typically I think a somewhat narrow grip on most back exercises, like as opposed to taking a super wide grip, will probably increase the degree of stretch being experienced, which might be a good thing for hypertrophy, I suspect. I don't fully know. So yeah, that's basically my rough guideline on how to train the back. Use the same rough volumes as you probably use for most other body parts. In my personal experience, they can handle a bit more volume than most muscle groups can. So you can experiment with that. And they can be trained slightly more frequently than most other muscle groups. But that's just my personal experience. There's a chance that is true or not true. Yeah. Do you agree with that? Am I training my back all wrong?
No, I think that all sounds good. I'll add another little bit of just kind of like anecdotal bullshit, I guess. I am personally a huge fan of unilateral back training. I think that so the concept of like the bilateral deficit, the idea that like you can recruit muscles on one side of your body better than both sides of your body simultaneously, is an idea that has become like somewhat controversial in recent years. Most of that stuff comes from quad studies, and this is not a episode about quad training, so I won't regale people with all of those stories. But yeah, just to say, it's like slightly controversial, but whatever. If it exists, though, I do suspect that it contributes more for back muscles than maybe some other muscle groups. Just because, like, at least in my experience, people have, to use a bro term, slightly worse, like, mind-muscle connection with their back muscles than they do, say, their quads or biceps or whatever. And so I find that even as someone who's been training for a long time, I feel like I can engage and feel my back muscles working better if I do unilateral stuff. So like one arm rows, that's a classic. I think everyone does them, but the one like kind of a typical exercise that I really ride for when it comes for back training or comes to back training. I fucking love one arm pull downs. I think they're great. And Milo, I think if you haven't done them, I think you would like them as well, because you can get a way deeper stretch in your lats with one arm pull downs than you can bilateral. Like you can, reach all the way up, obviously, but also kind of like over to the side, get a you can even do them standing with like one foot, like your opposite side foot on the seat of the pull down machine. So you're kind of like hinged and you're leaning towards like you're leaning away from the arm that you're using. So you're getting like some spinal lateral flexion in the mix as well to like even get a slightly deeper lat stretch in there. And my God, I love those. Like though, I think that's my favorite lat exercise. And if I haven't done much lat training in a while, or even if I've been doing some lat training, but I just haven't done those in a while, and I come back to them, I say this in a good way. Like listeners who don't have like as much of a masochistic streak might hear this and say, why do you do that? That sounds bad. But no, trust me, it's a hurt so good type of thing. The first time I do them in a while, like I feel like I've had like a lat tendon rupture. Like it feels dangerous, like how painfully sore my lats get close to their insertion, and I love it. Just based purely on like both the sensation I get during a workout and the agony that I'm in for the next day or two. It feels like they're stimulating my lats more than anything else. So yeah, single arm pull downs, I love them. Love, love, love.
Awesome. Yeah, I've tried similar variations out in the past. For me, it's just come down to, do I really want to do twice the number of sets? For some reason, for the back, I don't. For legs, I don't mind. For the back, I do. So, but yeah, that sounds like a way to stretch out the lats even more than during traditional training. So I can't fault that. All right, Pac, anything to add?
You covered me fully.
Wow, very good.
We've been both specializing in lat pull down, on the lat pull down lately, and it's a shame that the strength standards universally are judged by usually SBD and not even the strict press, because I am confident that we can beat a lot of people on the lat pull down on a specific machine, the matrix machine, more specifically. But yeah, Milo covered me fully, like as far as practical takeaways for clients go. And yeah, overall, I do not think that training your back is rocket science, as long as you've selected 2 to 3 exercises that pretty much cover everything that Milo mentioned. I very much doubt that you're not going to see really solid back development.
I think that wraps up all of the points we wanted to hit. So now we can move into some audience Q&A. Greg, would you like to tee us off?
Absolutely. So Joseph Robbins from Facebook asks, do you need to do both a vertical and horizontal pull for complete back development?
I do not think we should answer questions by people that have that are not able to strict press as much as I am, and can only push press more than I am. But joking aside, that's an inside joke between myself and Joseph, because he is an excellent push presser. So I hope you appreciated the shout out, Joseph. I'd say yes, based on exactly what we just said, what we just talked about. Now, obviously, you can hear New York in the background. They're coming to arrest me for this hot take, but there's no hot take. So, yes, would you, if let's say you did chin-ups only your whole life, would your back not look muscular? Probably, it would probably look fine, and you'd probably get away with some solid back development. But if you're trying to maximize muscular development of the back, doing both some vertical and horizontal pulling, this is probably your best bet for complete development.
Yeah, I think I agree with Pac fully. I think you might get more than half, maybe not more than half. If I had to put a rough number on it, you might get around half the development for your back. Just, hey, you're doing 50% of the variation you need to do. I do think that the muscles that are involved in specifically like the mid trap, lower trap, rhomboids, their functions do differ relatively substantially from just lats and teres major. And I think those muscles will be missing out on a fair bit of stimulus. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't think you can get away with just doing one of them. You probably do need to do both of them. But I don't think asking for someone to do 2 exercises per week is too large of an ask for someone trying to maximize hypertrophy.
I agree with that. One of my more lukewarm takes is that I don't know that like lat rowing does much for you if you're also doing vertical pulling. Like the lat exercises where you're pulling the implement like towards your stomach to primarily work your lats instead of more towards your chest to more work, I guess maybe like the upper fibers of your lats, but also your mid traps, rhomboids, stuff like that. Rear delts as well. I kind of think that a lat row is it's training basically the same stuff that like a pull down is. I don't think it's training your like horizontal pulling musculature as well as like a row to your chest would. And I don't think it's training your lats as well as a pull down does. It's still certainly a good exercise. Like I'm not telling people to not do it. If you're doing 4 or 5 or 6 lat exercises in a week, it's a perfectly good one to consider and have in your program. But I think if you're narrowing it down to 2, I think pull up or pull down and like a more horizontal row where your elbows are further out and you're pulling the thing closer to your chest rather than your stomach. I think that's the way to go to kind of maximize what you're hitting with 2 exercises.
Yeah, I think that's a lukewarm take indeed. I think it's too reasonable to be considered hot.
Sick. All right. Shane Duquette asks, people argue that pullovers aren't really a lat exercise. Rather, they're largely a teres major exercise. Lats are just a stabilizer that wouldn't be worked hard enough to get a stimulus. I guess that's not a question. That's a statement, but I suppose he wants our take on it.
Yeah, so I have previously stated that I think the pullover is a very good lat exercise, and that is a contentious topic nowadays on the socials. I think it essentially comes down to how much stock you put into neuromechanical matching and how much stock you put into the longer muscle length research. And based on what we discussed in the episode, I do think that if you're taking a set of dumbbell pullovers or barbell pullovers or what have you close to failure, the lats will be taken close to failure no matter what the difference in internal leverage is, or at least within reasonable constraints. And specifically when you consider that the dumbbell pullover does likely stretch out the dumbbell pullover, or any pullover really, in this case, in the question, does stretch out the lat quite meaningfully, I think it's going to be a very effective lat exercise. That is my stance. No one can tell you for sure. It's, again, it's a sort of question that is predicated on assumption after assumption after assumption. So it is essentially just educated gambling. And my educated gamble is that I think that it's a good exercise. Pack? Anything to add?
It's the only lat exercise that gets me sore, and as we know, soreness equals muscle growth, and that's why basketball yesterday was a muscle building activity, because we're both very sore from it today. But in all seriousness, no, echoing Milo, we cannot tell for sure. I feel my lats a lot. My lats hurt a lot after, and I say for certain it's the best in the world. No. Do I believe that my lats are not doing anything there? Equally no.
Yeah, and just to finish it off from my end, I think that when we do this educated gambling dance, we have to consider the strength of each piece of evidence we're using. I think that the evidence in favor of neuromechanical matching playing a large role for hypertrophy is relatively preliminary and or weak, whereas I think the evidence for a relatively generalizable principle of lower muscle length training being better for hypertrophy is, by comparison, relatively strong. And so that's ultimately what I weigh more heavily in my weighing up of the evidence. So that's kind of where I fall.
I have a middle ground take, which is that I kind of feel like it's a distinction without a difference. Like not entirely. Obviously, the lats and teres major are two separate muscles, but I think when people are interested in lat training, like oftentimes they want just like wide barn door lats that fucking block out the sun when they do a rear lat spread. And when I think back to like a lot of the best backs in bodybuilding history, when people say, "Oh, damn, that person had like crazy wide lats," a lot of times like they did, but they also had like really developed teres major, and I think that people often don't like really go out of their way to target it. So I think even if it's the case that it's predominantly working your teres major, I I mean, a lot of people listening to this podcast, I'm sure, could tell the difference between the two. But I bet more than half of the people even listening to the Stronger by Science podcast don't fully know the difference. And if you just looked at someone who had just a really great like bodybuilding, highly competitive back, with like good lat development and great teres major development, I bet more than half of the people listening to this episode would be like, damn, that person has crazy lat development, super wide, whatever. So I think like, let's just assume it's not a good lat exercise. Still a good exercise. And I suspect most people, even if it's a great teres major exercise and a bad lat exercise, they would look at the effects it has on their physique and say, damn, this was a really good lat exercise. So yeah, there is a large element to which I kind of think that like, even if it's not a good lat exercise, like who cares, you know?
Yeah, I concur fully in thinking that most people couldn't even tell the difference between teres major and lat hypertrophy, especially outside the context of the bodybuilding stage where people are at essential levels of body fat. And even then, I wouldn't be surprised if people still weren't able to tell the difference. So I agree. And I think, I don't know, it's one of those ongoing debates on the socials that I think is... what was the law you mentioned again, or the heuristic regarding the proportion or the relationship between the importance of a debate and the intensity of it?
Was it Sayre's law?
I think so, yes. No, that might have been the headline one, wasn't it?
No, that's Betteridge's law of headlines.
You got it. Yeah, so Sayre's law.
It's Sayre's law.
Where essentially the importance of an argument is inversely proportional. The importance, is inversely proportional to the intensity with which it goes on. So, yeah, moving on. We have a couple questions from Christian Strand. I think we can only cover the second one.
Cool. Yeah, so he asks, are deadlifting movements suitable for back hypertrophy training, especially the erectors?
Yes. So in some circles, in some, bodybuilding and natural bodybuilding circles, and I guess traditionally, the deadlift is often sometimes presented as a back exercise, sometimes as a leg exercise. And there's this notion that, you can really tell which bodybuilder has been deadlifting based on their back development on stage. Now, I do think that having some sort of hip hinge makes sense for erector development, but the idea that a bodybuilder's back, and keep in mind, a bodybuilder usually performs multiple rowing and pulling, just multiple back exercises. The idea that the deadlift is primarily a back exercise, I do not think is true. However, the deadlift as a form of a hip hinge exercise can be a way to develop your erectors. And that, I guess, can add to the thickness of the back or how impressive it looks from behind. But that's about it. Not really a back exercise, if you ask me.
Yeah, before Greg is going to give what seems to be a hot take based on the smirk he has displayed. I don't know. I think deadlifts for back are quite overrated. That is my contention. The way most people deadlift, I just don't think that they're going to be trained particularly close to failure or just in a particularly good way. Like the same way you would establish whether you think an exercise is good for hypertrophy, I think that deadlift fails on many of those counts for the back. Like, especially for lats, teres major, rhomboids, etc. I just don't think it's going to be a very effective exercise. For the erectors, I don't really know. I suspect it's probably at least decent, but I would say you're almost certainly better off with an isolation exercise because it's relatively unclear. Like, we can't epistemically make out whether the erector muscles are being trained particularly close to failure. Like, it's just hard to tell. Is a lifter rounding his back during a deadlift a cause of weakness in the erectors, causing him to like be unable to produce enough spinal extension torque to keep their back extended? Maybe. Or is it a way for them to make the deadlift easier on their hip extensors? Maybe. We can't really make it out either way. And so I don't know if it's a good erector exercise, but I do think it's a relatively poor upper back exercise. But Greg, I see you smirking. I think you're about to lay some fire on us.
Yeah, I mean, I actually disagree. I mean, I think there are like two separate but related questions here, which is one, is it are deadlifts perhaps like set by set and rep by rep a less efficient back developer than, you know, for spinal erectors than back extensions, or for you know, your mid traps and rhomboids than like rows to your chest? I think, yeah, probably so. You know, like, it's a general purpose thing, and there are specific purpose things that target the same muscles, probably do it better, allow you to safely train those muscles closer to failure, et cetera, et cetera. But I do also think that, I don't know, like the maximalist take that, like, oh, it's like a bad back exercise because you're not taking most of these muscles close to failure, training them through a full range of motion, blah, 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 whatever. I will admit that I don't have like firm citations for any of this, but like, no one has firm citations for fucking any of this shit because there's no research on back growth. I think that deadlifts are like a pretty good back exercise, and I think that if you train them the way that athletes that deadlift competitively would train deadlifts, or just like pulling in general, like hip hinge pulling, whatever, I think that you get pretty good back development from it. I do think the thing that suffers is lat width. Like, I don't think you're going to get a really sick lat spread from deadlifts, but I have spent my entire training career around powerlifters. I was going to say many of whom, but I'll upgrade that to most of whom. Most of whom don't do accessories. Like, we don't really like accessories for the most part. We want to go in, lift heavy shit, and then go home. Like, there are absolutely powerlifters that do plenty of accessories. A lot of us don't. So yeah, spent my entire training career around powerlifters. Quite a few strongmen who mostly train events and maybe toss in some like front squats or bench press for like general preparation. But again, oftentimes don't do much accessory work. You don't see that many pull-ups. You don't see that many rows, whatever. And weightlifters who really fucking hate accessories even more than the powerlifters and strongmen. Like, you're going to see a lot of clean pulls. You're going to see a lot of snatch pulls. I mean, like, the sport is snatch and clean and jerk, and accessory lifts are like snatch pulls, clean pulls. Like, you might, yeah, like, occasionally you'll see someone do like some lunges because they do a split jerk and they don't want to be like super imbalanced. But you don't see that many accessories there either often. Some countries do a lot of accessories, like you see Chinese weightlifters do a lot of accessories, but yeah, most of the weightlifters I have trained around, not a ton of accessory work, not a ton of direct back training. Athletes in all three of those sports, tremendous back development. Again, you don't see like crazy lat width, but like fucking thick traps, like upper back thickness, like the type of thing you'd get from like rows to your chest, extremely on point. Really developed erectors. Like, I have just seen far too many people who've gotten extremely impressive back development with very few rows and very few pull downs, just basically only doing deadlifts. And I'm like, could they have maybe achieved the same level of development with less time and less effort by choosing some other exercises instead? Yeah, I'd say definitely maybe, and potentially even probably. Like, I'm very sympathetic to that, but I also think that if someone says, "Hey, I want really great back development and I don't like doing rows," I really think you can just do a shitload of deadlifts and pull downs and be in pretty good shape.
I think that's a decent take. And I don't want to make it sound like deadlifts do nothing for your back, like putting aside your erectors even. But I do suspect like it's almost like we flip positions here where you're more of an empiricist in the absence of any formal empirical evidence, and I'm more of a rationalist. But I do think the case against deadlifts theoretically for back is relatively strong. And I do suspect like you might just be dealing with a fair amount of survivorship bias. Like the people that you're around are probably quite a bit more jacked than the average weightlifter. Like personally, I've known quite a few weightlifters and powerlifters that skip their accessories altogether. And their back isn't very jacked. Like, and obviously I could also be dealing with survivorship bias. But I think it can be difficult to disentangle that whole causality situation. Because like, I know people who don't really lift weights and are relatively jacked, So
Yeah.
it's difficult.
I mean, when I walk into a powerlifting gym, or like when I walk into a gym and I'm just looking around, I'm like, who else here is powerlifters? Like, who are my people here? I will say the things that do jump out to me most are overdeveloped quads, overdeveloped pecs, and overdeveloped traps. Like, I do unironically think that deadlifts are like quite solid for trap development. But like
Upper traps, right?
when I think of powerlifter physique, even if someone is not like super muscular and well developed to begin with, I do like slightly better upper back development than most of the rest of their physique is still something that like jumps out to me as like a core part of a powerlifter physique.
Fair enough. I think that's a fair take.
We must not discount though the presence of accessories because cool, yeah. Like many powerlifters are not that great at doing their accessories, but still, but potentially their strength training background. Doing a few years of your 5x5s and your whatever generic programs, so your 5-3-1s that all include some form of like chin-ups and rows and yeah, I don't know. With weightlifters, I'll echo Milo. Like I've seen some because I've trained at Olympic weightlifting gyms in Greece, and sure, like obviously, if you look at a guy, some of those people, on the beach, and you see their back, you can definitely tell that they're doing something, that they're working out. And I think really developed erectors can make a back look, much more trained than if they're not really well developed. But I don't know, man. Aside from some phenoms. Like if you look at, for example, Joe Sullivan, who has recently, I don't know, gotten into bodybuilding or something, and he's a beast when it comes to like squat and deadlift strength. And his back looks jacked, but nowhere near a bodybuilder who may even be natty and is, I don't know. But okay, now I'm getting into specific comparisons. Overall, I think deadlift's great, but if you're like, okay, I want my back to get bigger, focusing on the deadlift, I think, is not
Poor choice.
Yeah, it's not the way to go, if that makes sense. I think that's where we're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I said multiple times that I do think that like rep by rep and set by set, there are probably better options. But I do think I think things have come full circle to the point that people probably underestimate deadlifts as a back developer.
Fair enough.
I think that's pretty reasonable.
So it depends.
Sure.
Cool. Next question.
Yeah. Okay, so Randy D718 on Reddit asks, a lot of strength programs, including SBS, seem to recommend one back exercise for back work every day. How optimal or suboptimal is this for hypertrophy?
Mr. Greg Knuckles, I believe
I
you've
can
written
answer.
this.
Yeah, I can answer this just in the context of like why it's in the Stronger by Science programs like that.
Please do.
And that's that back exercises, unlike exercises for a lot of other muscle groups, can be limited by like grip strength and hand fatigue. And this is anecdotal, but like if I'm going to do, 2 vertical pulls and 2 horizontal pulls in a week, if I do them all in a single session, sometimes even if I'm using straps, like by the last exercise, I just feel like I'm not fucking doing anything because my hands are fucking tired. Whereas if I just do like really, really hit it hard for 1 back exercise a day, or like sometimes 2, if I'm really like focusing on my back training, I'm like, okay, like I can get it in and things are good. So yeah, I practically am a fan of spreading out back work just purely due to hand fatigue. You don't want that to be a limiter. You do 1 back exercise a day. I also think it's good. I also think it's reasonably good for grip development because like you're getting a little bit of like, secondary grip work in virtually all of your training sessions. And just the research on frequency tends to indicate that higher frequencies have a mostly neutral to maybe slightly positive impact on muscular development. So just in general, as with any other muscle group, I don't think you're missing out on anything by spreading your volume out a little bit more, and you may be getting something positive out of that. So yeah, I with any muscle group, I think it's neutral to positive to train it every training day and just kind of like doing the full body thing. But I think that that's like especially true for back training, just because, yeah, like your ability to train your pecs isn't going to be limited. If you're doing 3 pec exercises in a workout, you're not going to be like, damn, on this third one, I really feel like I'm not using my pecs well because my hands are tired. You know what I mean? But like that kind of can be the case with back training. So with back training, even more than training for other muscle groups, I just think it's practically beneficial to spread it out through the week. Yeah, just so hand fatigue doesn't limit your ability to train the muscles you're trying to train.
Wow. Besides hand fatigue, that is exactly the answer I would have given as well as to why it might be beneficial. Yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable.
Hand fatigue may be top of mind for me because I have very small hands.
Yeah, I have experienced, the only time I've ever really experienced my forearms being an issue when training my back was when training with Kyriakos Grizzly. When he made me do like a 30 rep drop set with like my first set being 5 reps and still while using straps, the only thing I felt was an indescribable forearm pump. My back felt unaffected. And so I think that, yeah, for most people it may not be so much of a concern, but for some people it can definitely be.
Okay. Mouth words. I think I know who this is. He asks, Cheaty Rose, good idea or the greatest idea? Is this whole thing?
I think that is, yes.
Okay. Okay. So Cheaty Rose, good idea or the greatest idea? I recall some discussion recently around lengthened partials and how cutting the top ROM in pull-ups or rows still hits the lengthened position. But when I think of body English, I think more about hip extension to make the lengthened position easier out of the bottom. Is it all just a self-fulfilling prophecy so we can do back work every day because the lats are big, they can take it, when they're actually cutting out the hardest, most beneficial portion of the range of motion to do so? Or is it truly exposing the lats and back to more work by circumventing the limitations of the biceps or something? Or maybe Cheaty Rows are better for strength and hypertrophy on account of horking around bigger weights.
All right, that is a multifaceted question that I'll try to answer. I do think Cheaty Rows, first up, are probably better for strength and hypertrophy, but specifically when strength is defined as deadlift strength, probably, because they are then more akin to deadlifts than straight rows are, and so it becomes more specific to deadlifts, and specificity is important. But then when it comes to why are cheaty rows beneficial, I'm not sure they're beneficial for growth necessarily. I think the benefit in terms of the lengthened position could just as well be achieved by doing partials instead and cutting out that top position entirely. You would still be able to use more load on account of missing out on the most challenging position in the lift, and therefore you'd be challenging that lengthened position a bit more. And I think you'd be missing out on the additional fatigue that comes with involving your hip extensors and involving your lower back a bit more as well, or what have you. So I'm generally in favor of keeping rows stricter, and I don't think they're necessarily more beneficial by involving more body English. For strength, as I said, I think they're probably more beneficial if you're cheating, but then I think, are your rows really where you want to increase specificity? Could you not just do strict rows and do more deadlift work potentially? That's a different discussion altogether, but I think for hypertrophy, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. And I think cheaty rows, if they are to be beneficial for hypertrophy of the back, would be beneficial predominantly through allowing you to handle more load in lengthened position. I think even if you're cheating, provided you're lifting the load with maximal intent, you'll still be using your back to its fullest in a lengthened position, just with more load. And you'd be making the shortened position relatively easier to achieve by getting more momentum into it and essentially hoisting the weight up, so to speak. So yeah, that's my take. I wouldn't really recommend cheaty rows for hypertrophy necessarily. Pack?
Exactly same take. With the added benefit of, I don't know, I don't see much of a benefit for cheating rows besides having fun and lifting heavy stuff for the fun of it. I don't get what more you'd get from a controlled row where you're more likely to control the eccentric because you can handle the load, you can focus on getting that stretch, and it just doesn't become a sort of like, okay, let's survive this set and just move the weight up and down until an arbitrary number of repetitions has been hit. Like, I've seen powerlifters talk about cheat rows as an accessory to the deadlift. And okay, sure, whatever, but like, why not just do some hip hinge variation as an accessory to the deadlift? The few videos that I've seen of like world-class powerlifters swearing that it was the cheat rows that helped their deadlift have left me unsatisfied with the explanation as to why that's true. Plus, obviously, all of the confounders, with the main one being them still deadlifting. So overall, if you like cheat rows and you have a lot of fun while doing them, and you're in the gym and your workouts are 10 times better, and you still do your pull downs and your whatever chest supported machine rows, sure, do them. You're not gonna lose muscle mass. You're still gonna make some gains for sure. But if you're trying, if you want to maximize hypertrophy and you want an exercise or a row variation that is effective at doing that, then cheat rows are probably not your best bet.
Yeah, I'm on record within this episode saying that I like cheat rows. I do feel my lats more in them than like strict rows targeting the lats, but I am also on record in this episode saying that I think that like pull-ups and pull-downs are a better lat exercise than like lat rows are. And those two things coexist. If I am to do rows for my lats, I do like cheat rows. I think that there's an art to them. I think that like a cheat row done well and a cheat row done poorly look visually identical, and it's just kind of the only person that knows the truth is the person doing them. But yeah, like if you're still pulling with maximum intent, like before like the hip hinging contributes to getting the weight up, you're essentially doing like a maximum intensity partial at the bottom of the, or like a maximum intensity like isometric at the bottom of the lift. And even if the weight does still come down fast on the eccentric, you're still resisting it as hard as you can. Like, it should still be a pretty good stimulus. But I do also think it can be easy to get lazy, and basically you're just doing like partial RDLs and you happen to be holding onto the bar and it touches your belly. And yeah, those two things can look very similar. And I think as you fatigue in a set, it's easy for like good cheat rows to become bad, lazy cheat rows. And in general, I do still think that for lat development, you're better off with pull-ups or pull-downs. And I really don't see much utility for like cheat rows to your chest. Like when people are doing them, they're mostly doing like the lat version of rows rather than kind of the upper back, like mid trap rhomboid upper lat version of rows, I guess. So yeah, I think they're fun. I think they can be effective, but I think that if you're trying to maximize efficiency, like you're trying to get the most possible per set out of your time training, I think that there are better options for the muscles that you would be training. But I also just think if you like doing them and if you are actually like exerting maximum effort with your lats and like not just using hip hinging to move it, yeah, I think that there are more effective exercises, but I think it still can be effective. And if you enjoy it and if your time in the gym isn't like super limited, yeah, go for it. Why not? Like have some fun. Another thing that I'll just say as it relates to like efficiency more broadly is I do think that a lot can be said about like the joys of training and doing things that you like doing, and how things matter less if you just have time in the day to spend more time in the gym. Because for instance, like I can say that I don't think cheat rows are like the most efficient exercise in the world in terms of like how much you're stimulating the muscles on a set by set basis. But that only fucking matters, I think, if you only have like 45 minutes to train. If you're someone who is a gym rat, you love the gym, you go 4 or 5 days a week, spend an hour and a half, 2 hours there, you have plenty of time in your training week to do exercises that aren't like as efficient on a set by set basis and you just love doing, you know, like, if like 10 sets of lat work in your workout is enough to like get as much stimulation for your lats as they can get in a workout or whatever, and you're doing 15 sets of lat work in a workout, who fucking cares if like 3 of those sets aren't the most efficient? Like, yeah, past a certain point, you're maybe training more than you like strictly need to just because you love it, you know? And yeah, so if you have 90 minutes per week total to train and you're trying to make the most of that time, I'd say, yeah, do something other than cheat rows. But if you just really like doing them or you have plenty of time in your week to do other exercises, yeah, go for it. Why not? Have fun. That's my take.
Beautiful. We started this podcast out being strong by science, and now it's strong by art. How to perfect your row, the cheat row specifically.
Art or by science?
I
mean, my like most emotionally felt training takes are mostly like just have fun, I guess. I don't know. Like I really and truly think, whatever. Now we're back to philosophy by science. I think though that a lot of like training content online is developed and delivered as if everyone in the gym is trying to be a world champion powerlifter or a world champion bodybuilder or a world champion athlete in some sport or another. Or if they're not, they're at least training with the same sort of orientation as those people where, you know, given your amount of time to train, any effort that is not used as efficiently and effectively as possible is wasted time. Like if within a year you could gain 3 pounds of muscle and you in fact only gain 2 pounds of muscle, that's a tragedy, you know, because like that last pound is really fucking critical because you're absolutely trying to maximize everything. And like, I just don't think many people are on that goddamn wavelength. I think most people are trying to make gains. Like they have some physique goals they're working towards. They want to get stronger, but like most people who train consistently, like someone who's been in the gym for more than a couple years and did it has dawned on them they're never going to be a world champion in anything. Or maybe they never even wanted to in the first place, but they're still going week after week, month after month, year after year. They are mostly training because they love it. And like there are still some results that they want to get, but if they could enjoy their training 50% more or get 10% better results, they might tell themselves, yeah, like I'm going to do the thing for 10% more results. But a lot of their behaviors are geared towards, no, I'm going to do the thing I like 50% more. Because like, yeah, once you're in it for a while and the gains slow way the fuck down, which they do for everyone, you stick with it because you like it. And yeah, I don't know. It's something that does frustrate me a little bit is how centralizing ideas of like effectiveness and efficiency are, which are really only like the number one most salient and almost like solely important thing only for people who have like the most aggressive, like highest level competitive aspirations. And in doing so, things that people enjoy doing are kind of like put down and shit on. And it's like, hey, you're doing this thing that's not why would you do cheat rows? Like, it's just an ego lift. You're wasting your time. There's like better things. And it's like, yeah, you know why people do ego lifts? Because they're fucking fun. And maybe they're not the most effective exercise in the world, but guess what? I've been training for a long ass time. And if things went really well for me, maybe I'm going to put on a pound of muscle this year. And guess what? I'm not going to be a fucking bodybuilder. So like, if I gain a pound of muscle this year, or like, honestly, 0 pounds of muscle this year, I don't care. I just enjoy lifting weights and working out. And so like, yeah. If I just like doing something, I'm gonna do it. And I really feel like that's how most people who train for a while are, you know, like they just like an exercise or they're just like trying a new thing. And I think that it is like relatively toxic for just notions of enjoyment to be completely eschewed, and things to be put down because they're not like theoretically the most efficient and effective way to train, because efficiency and effectiveness are, I think, important concerns for everyone, but I honestly don't think they're the main concern for most people. And it's just like notions that like if you're not training like a robot that's trying to like completely maximize everything all the time, that you're doing something wrong. Like I don't think that that's like a helpful orientation, I guess.
Yeah. And like for the record, our training is mine a bit more than Milo's, but Milo's as well is very heavily focused around the stuff we enjoy. The issue I think with ego lifting is the ego response to the criticism of, oh, you're doing this for ego lifting. And then instead of saying, yeah, that's why I'm doing it, because I love it and it's fun to do whatever. Zercher shrugs from boxes and whatever, cheat rows or even cheat curls or whatever. It's that people try to justify the ego lifting by forcing some mechanism or explaining that, oh no, you know, this targets this a bit more. And then when you see also bodybuilders do that, then and parrot mechanisms and rationales for why this form is better than the other, it just creates this weird environment where from both sides, from one, the optimal bros and then the non-optimal bros, the idea of lifting for fun is not okay.
It's not considered.
It's not considered, yeah, because the ego bro, instead of saying, yeah, man, cool, bro, I'm a recreational lifter. Sure, yeah, I'm here lifting weights. I'm bettering my health and I'm still getting a ton of benefits. I don't care about that theoretical 0.3 centimeter muscle gain that I could get. You know, many people get a bit of a knee-jerk response, give a bit of a knee-jerk response that includes some reason why they're doing it, because they feel guilty about having fun. So we're here to break that stigma on Stronger by Science.
Yeah, I do think some of that is like a kind of understandable defensive response though, because like people come at them almost like in an accusatory way, like by doing something that honestly looks quite fun but maybe isn't optimal, you're doing something wrong, you know. Whereas like if that energy wasn't attached to it and someone just asked them neutrally, like, hey, why are you doing this thing, they might say like, well, trains my lats, also I think it's fun. I think that some of that is like people matching the energy that people come at them with. And if the whole kind of like, if the social rules of the soup you're swimming in are like, if you're not doing things that are like optimal and maximal, you're doing something wrong, then you almost feel like you need to justify things on those terms, even if that's not why you're doing those things in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. I think when you're questioning the non-optimal bro who's just having fun with a presupposition of everything one does needs to be done to maximize utility and progress, then the way you communicate that to the person cheating their lift, for example, can come off as quite aggressive, or like you're questioning why they're even doing it and why they're not acting in line with your own reasons for lifting. And I think like seeing someone else cheat can almost come off to you, if you're lifting with the purpose of maximizing gains, for example, as like transgressive. Like, why is this person not acting in service of the same ideals as I am? And then it can cause you to question yourself and why you're lifting in the first place. And wait, I could lift for fun too? And then that kind of gives you a bit of a pause and reflection, hopefully. But yeah, next episode, how to have fun. That's the title.
Honestly, man, where it's at. Training these days is super fun. No structure, freestyle, overhead press 6 times a week. We're in the gym an hour and a half. Peace. Like, I think especially for recreational lifters who've been lifting for a while, lifting for fun is the promised land, and that's how you can lift. Keep at it. Because there comes a point where, realistically speaking, maybe I could gain an appreciable amount of muscle mass on my calves because I have never trained them directly. But at this stage, even with the most optimized of programs, we're not looking at an insane level of muscle gain, if any at all, for some muscle groups. So yeah, big proponents of lifting for fun. Don't let our hatred for the cheat row detract from that. It's not the cheat row itself, it's the people trying to force the cheat row as an optimal exercise, because it should be acceptable to say it's a fun exercise. Do it. It's cool.
Yeah, truly the duality of man, to hate the cheat row for scientific reasons and to envy the cheat rower for the human condition,
Absolutely. So I think that wraps it up for this episode. Cool.
Indeed.
I think so.
Do you guys have any closing thoughts before we sign off?
Not really.
I think that's it.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening to another episode of the Stronger by Science podcast. We will be back in a couple weeks, and during the intervening fortnight, be good. Hope you enjoy yourself. Do whatever kind of back training you feel like doing, whether that be pullovers for lat development, whether that be cheat rows, whether that be a good standard pull down and row to your chest. It's all valid. Some of it may be more effective than others, but guess what? All back training is good back training. Big backs are sick. So we're wishing you love and light and big backs for the next 2 weeks, and we will be back then. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Peace.